Okay. So we are going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. And we will begin with a roll call vote of attendance. Drew, would you please lead us in that?
Certainly will. Good afternoon, SCTA, RCPA Board of Directors. Director Janice Cater-Thompson had informed me that she would be absent today. So we will start with Director Chris Corsi.
Here.
Director Susan Harvey. Oops, Director Ben Ford is here for Susan Harvey.
That's right. Here.
Director Gerard Giudice.
Here.
Director Nisa Hinton.
Here.
Director Ariel Kelly.
Here.
Director Sandra Lowe.
Here.
Director Jeff Krepke.
Here.
Director David Rabbit.
Here.
Director Rosa Reynosa. Who I don't see. And Vice Chair Melanie Bagby. Present. And Chair Linda Hopkins.
Present.
And with that, we have a quorum.
Thank you so much. And there were no requests for remote attendance, so we do not have any teleconference disclosures today. Just noting that for the record. With that, we will move on to public comments on items not on the regular agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to approach the podium, make comment?
Yes.
Welcome, Dwayne.
Hello. Hello, my name is Dwayne DeWitt. I'm from Roseland. I wanted to say thank you for the staff for putting together very nice written minutes, being able to see what might have transposed in various parts of a meeting. One of the things I see is that the approval of the minutes is not on this agenda today. So I wanted to point out that in the minutes, the comments that I made, number 3 on that last meeting agenda, are almost totally accurate except for one word that got in there somehow and makes things seem a bit different. It's when I was pointing out that this area over in Roseland, that's a natural area we call the neighborhood, has had vehicles, motor vehicles drive onto the property at various property owners' homes and sites for over 100 years. And it's never been paved. That was the key to the statement. In the minutes, it says because for over 100 years, vehicles have not been driving onto that land, but they never paved. So we got to show that, yes, vehicles have gone onto the land. They just never had to pave it for over 100 years. People could drive on that property, including very large fire trucks. Because unfortunately, over the last number of years, we've had some transient vagrants go through and probably inadvertently start fires with campfires, things of that nature. And the fire department's been able to go down there and do a really good job of getting those fires out without them spreading to the houses right next door. As a matter of fact, houses closer than that wall to me, to where some of these transient vagrants camp and have their fires. So once again, thank you to the staff for the good job they do, getting minutes out to people and doing a good effort of reflecting what's been said in the meetings. So then I wanted to give you one other insight, because I still ride Golden Gate Transit, which takes me down to Samtrans or Muni in San Francisco, depending on who I'm using. And then here locally, I use the bus systems all the time. And I see that there's some funding going to go forward from the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors to buy a really expensive electric bus. And I'm like, you know, I'm on buses that aren't really full ever anymore. Very few riders actually on buses. And it would seem that you could use the smaller buses that are used for what's called paratransit. Those are used over in Europe and many countries to get people where they need to be, and they work real well. So rather than having expensive electric empty buses, let's work on just using what we got and making it so there are even smaller buses in the future when you have to replace them. Thank you kindly. I'll continue to ride the bus and advocate for Golden Gate Transit all the way, every day. Thank you kindly.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. Any other members of the public wish to comment in person on matters not on the agenda, but within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board?
Any other members from the public wishing to speak on items not on the agenda?
Thank you very much. And I also do want to note for the record that we did have a pre-submitted public comment from Eris Weaver that has been posted online that is actually regarding item 5.3. Oh, and also want to acknowledge that Director Reynosa is present. Welcome and thank you. All right, with that, then we will close the public comment and move on to our consent calendar. Are there any questions on the consent calendar or comments or anyone who wishes to pull anything? I want to recognize that Dwayne had a small sort of correction. Can we make that correction for the record? Great. Thank you very much. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and open the consent calendar to public comment. Any members of the public wish to comment on the consent calendar?
Yes, miss. Hello, my name is Dwayne DeWitt. I'm from Roseland. In 2007, I participated in the Roseland Community-Based Transportation Plan that was funded partially by this body and MTC. It's really important that you actually get as much community involvement as possible in a community-based transportation plan. The one that I was involved in, very few people from the community were actually contacted and talked with. It was one of those things like, oh, this guy's from here and we'll at least let him be in the meeting, but we're not really so concerned about what he's talking about. And that's really not the way these things are supposed to work. You're going to spend a lot of money to this transportation contract award to Fehr and Peers. And it's one of those situations where, especially for South Santa Rosa Avenue, you need to get as many people that actually use a bus to be a part of the plan. As it stands right now, the only people down there that use the bus pretty much are those folks who might not have a place to be sheltered, or those folks who are sheltered at what's called the Palms Inn. They ride the buses. Hardly anyone else does. Lots of traffic on that road, very busy stretch of road, very wide. I don't know if you ever tried to cross a wide road like that. It's one of those situations where a community-based transportation plan could take the time to talk to the people who actually live in the area and may utilize public transportation. If you're not talking to them, the whole plan is like nebulous. It's not like it really is about what's about to occur. The people that ride in cars will still keep doing what they're doing. So one would hope that this idea of getting people out of their cars will be discussed in depth with people who live in that area. There's a bureaucratic term for it. The bureaucratic term is robust. Let's have a robust discussion down there with those South Santa Rosa folks about, are they even going to use the buses? And should we plan appropriately if they're not going to use the buses? That's key for it. So last but not least, I think maybe the screen that I'm looking at is projected up there, because I frequently see all of you looking above my head to see how much time the guy's got left. It's kind of funny. So enjoy the humor of it all, okay? Yeah, you know, I got a picture from when I used to have hair, but I made some politicians a little bit upset and lightning struck me. All the best to you.
Thank you, Dwayne. Any other members of the public wish to speak on the consent calendar?
I'm currently not seeing any members of the public with their hands up to speak on the consent calendar.
Great. With that, I will bring it back to my colleagues and see if there is a motion to approve the consent calendar with the amendment to correct the record on Dwayne's remarks.
So moved.
Second.
All right. And I think that we can do this just without a roll call. Yes. All right. All in favor? Aye. Any abstentions? Any opposed? All right. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you so much. And with that, we'll move on to our regular calendar item. And James, do you want to introduce this? All right. Kick it off.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Daniel Saber. He's the Assistant Director for Housing and Local Planning at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Association of Bay Area Governments. He's here today to provide an update on the Regional Transit-Oriented Community Policy and to provide some information on technical assistance programs they've developed to support housing element updates, PDA planning, and other housing and land use work. Compliance with the TOC policy is voluntary, but will determine eligibility and competitiveness for some regional discretionary funding programs, including ABAG 4, which is expected in 2026. I also want to give reference to two folks that are on Zoom. Ada Chan is our ABAG staff liaison, as well as Jane Riley from the Napa Sonoma Housing Collaborative will also be available on Zoom in case there's any questions for them, in addition to the questions for Daniel. So Daniel, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I know the folks at Four Leaf needed to make a quick adjustment. And so I believe Luke is the staff person who will be assisting us in case there are any questions on that. But thank you for the introduction. Once again, my name is Daniel Saver. I'm the Assistant Director for Housing and Local Planning at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments. I'm very pleased to be here with you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the staff for working so collaboratively to enable us to come and present this to y'all. So I do know that so the main focus of the presentation today is going to be about the transit-oriented communities policy. Then I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about technical assistance and grant opportunities available at the regional level to support the local governments here in Sonoma County to try to advance our shared housing, transportation, climate goals. So let me go ahead and, I'm controlling this. All right, so let me. Okay, here we go. So here's my quick roadmap. So I'll give you a quick background, a little bit of an implementation update on the transit-oriented communities. I'll call it the TOC policy for short. It's a little bit of a mouthful. And then talk about funding and technical assistance. I believe that you've received a presentation in the last number of months about the TOC policy. So I've got a lot of slides in here with a lot of content. Hopefully that is familiar to all of you. I'm going to run through those slides relatively quickly, but you have the material here in your packet as a reference point, and I'm also happy to take any questions on that as we move forward. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So in terms of the background on the TOC policy, so this is a policy adopted by MTC. It applies to areas within a half mile of existing or planned fixed guideway transit stations. So that includes rail stations, bus rapid transit stops, and ferry terminals. And so primarily here in Sonoma, that is connected to the smart stations that y'all. The TOC policy focuses on 4 core policy arenas. Land use density, housing policy, parking, and station access and circulation. So there are requirements related to each of those 4 components. I'll get into that in just a minute. And kind of, I'm trying to lead with the punchline here, which, as was noted by staff, the import of this policy is that it may influence future funding decisions by MTC. And so, you know, I say that at the beginning to try to capture everyone's attention that this isn't kind of just a nice policy conversation. It also affects dollars coming down the line. The first anticipated opportunity where we expect that to happen based on the commission's direction so far is for the One Bay Area Grant Program, or OBAG, and the OBAG 4 cycle is expected in 2026. So quick review of the goals of the TOC policy. So first is to increase the overall housing supply. I think, as y'all are very likely well aware, we have a pretty severe housing shortage in the Bay Area, including up here in Sonoma County. And so the idea is to try to increase the housing supply with a specific emphasis on affordable housing. Second is in areas where there are regional transit hubs to also increase density of commercial and business activity to try to support the active transportation types and walkability, bikeability, general overall vibrancy of these station areas. Third, to prioritize as I just said, bus transit, active transportation, shared mobility within and to and from these transit-rich areas. And that also includes connections with equity priority communities that themselves may not be located proximate to these station areas themselves. And then finally, to support and build partnerships that create more equitable transit-oriented communities. This is an MTC policy, but MTC does not control local land use decisions. It does not control local housing policy and parking policies themselves. So we know coming into this that this is a partnership with our local governments. So I mentioned the 4 policy arenas. This slide tries to very tightly summarize the policy requirements within each of those arenas. So in terms of density, there are certain required minimum densities for new residential and commercial office development. Those vary depending on the level of transit service. So we're expecting greater degrees of density in areas where there are much greater levels of transit service. And there are different standards that apply based on, for example, SMART is considered to be a regional commuter line. It has different density standards than, for example, downtown San Francisco, knowing that the different transit levels will necessitate a different approach to the land use and policy approach that we need to take. The second area is affordable housing and commercial stabilization policies. Here we have essentially policy menus within the 3 Ps. So that's production of new housing, preservation of existing housing that's affordable to lower and middle income residents, and the protection of existing residents from displacement. And there's policy options within each of those three Ps, and jurisdictions have to choose two from the menu within each of those Ps. So there's a fair amount of flexibility and optionality that's kind of baked into the policy. Additionally, there is a requirement to choose one policy from a menu of commercial stabilization policies as well. When it comes to parking, there is a requirement to have parking maximums for new residential and general or neighborhood commercial development. Those also vary based on the level of service. So similar, there are different transit tiers. So the standards that apply here in Sonoma are different again than those in downtown Oakland, downtown San Francisco. And then finally, there's a transit station access and circulation set of requirements that generally align with the complete streets policy, as well as a need to complete access gap analysis and identify opportunities to implement mobility hubs. So I'm happy to unpack those details if there are more specific questions. But I believe that touches upon some of the content that you've previously looked at. So this slide is touching upon a second facet of the TOC policy. So a lot of what I was just describing is kind of the basic policy framework that may apply in OBAG 4, which are dollars that typically are going directly to local governments passing through all of you in the county and local program. Additionally, the TOC policy does apply to what we call transit extensions. So the most relevant one here, naturally, is the extension of SMART to Healdsburg and Cloverdale. And so the commission about, when was it? It was October, so not quite a year ago, adopted an amendment to the TOC policy to clarify the application of the policy to transit extensions specifically. And the purpose of this was try to standardize the timeline for when transit extension projects must comply with the TOC policy. And the answer there is 2026, and establish some realistic expectations for how compliance should be evaluated based on the different project stages. So the three numbered lists that you see in front of you here relates to those different project stages. And so the requirements between now and 2026 are keyed to the level or the project phase. So we're expecting less work from local governments for projects that are in very early stages. If you're still in the environmental review process, maybe you're not even sure exactly where the station area is going to be located precisely. It'd be very difficult to require certain densities within a half mile if you don't know where to put the point in the middle of the half mile. So there's a more lenient standard there. For projects in the second phase, project design and early right-of-way acquisition, that's where we're expecting that the station area is pretty well defined. Environmental review has typically been completed. And there we are asking for a commitment letter from the jurisdiction, not to be in compliance with all these requirements right now, but that they will be working towards compliance by 2026. And then finally, for projects that are essentially already under construction, the idea here is that we're not requiring any sort of commitment to access regional discretionary funding, because the goal of the TOC policy is to support transit. So if there's an active transit project that's already under construction, we're not trying to hold up the funding based on these policy requirements. The policy requirements will come into play if jurisdictions that have those stations are seeking future OBAG funding. That's when it would come into play. So I named this slide. I know that there's a lot happening right now with the extension of SMART, and that is mixed up in Play and Bay Area. There's kind of a much broader conversation related to that. I'm not here to kind of get into the specific details of it, but the way that plays out, kind of exactly that will affect when and how and for which stations the TOC policy will kick into compliance. Okay. Moving along. So I keep using the word compliance. It sounds very strict. What do we mean by compliance? The policy itself that was adopted by our commission does not specify exactly what we mean by compliance. And we have gone back to our commission a few times since they adopted the policy to get some feedback from them about how strictly we should be approaching this. And the punchline here, as you see highlighted in yellow, is that the commission has directed us to hold the line on what those policy standards are, but allow for significant flexibility in the way that we implement those standards based on the diversity of jurisdictions that we have in the 9-county Bay Area, based on the fact that this is a policy that we expect will need to be implemented over many years, because there's a significant amount of work that needs to be completed by local governments in order to get to compliance. So essentially what we've heard from the commission is, this is the goalpost. We want to keep pointing everyone towards the right goalpost, but we know that we need to be flexible in the way that each different city or each different county is moving towards that goalpost based on their particular circumstances. So some guiding principles that we have are that we want to advance the goals. The commission has directed us to advance the goals of the TOC policy, but to be considerate of that local context as we do so. And importantly, to ensure communication and transparency throughout the process, evidenced by presentations like the one I'm giving to you today. So on the flexibility piece, there's something I wanted to point out is that the policy itself was designed with a certain amount of flexibility already baked in. So we are going to be devising a way to apply additional flexibility, but I did want to highlight the ways in which flexibility is already present. And it's something that your local staff are already working with our team to navigate exactly how this would work in their specific context. So for example, the residential and office densities, they vary by tier. So again, we're not expecting downtown San Francisco to have the same land uses as we are downtown Cotati. Similarly, the commercial and housing policies, it's a menu-based approach. So we've identified a number of options. Jurisdictions can choose the policies that best fit their local needs and local context. The parking requirements similarly vary based on level of transit service. There's also, when it comes to transportation demand management, there's a menu of options that jurisdictions can choose one of the best that most suits their needs from that list, et cetera. So again, I'm happy to dwell on those details if we need to, if there's specific questions, but I'm going to keep us going to talk about implementation. So as a part of that core value of ensuring transparency and collaboration as we go about implementing this policy, our team has been conducting one-on-one meetings with every single jurisdiction where the TOC policy applies. And currently, we have had 117 individual meetings and small group meetings across the 9-county Bay Area, including 17 meetings with, and this is all generally at the staff level, I should say. So 17 meetings with local staff here throughout the county of Sonoma. Additionally, we have been working to finalize the administrative guidance. So the policy lays out kind of the key policy parameters, but how do you actually apply that given the way that your local zoning code is constructed? We're getting a lot of very detailed questions, and so we're developing a guidance document to help try to resolve those in a very rules-based, transparent manner so that we're trying to reduce the amount of discretion and opportunity for there to be kind of disagreement over like the way that the policy will apply. Additionally, we're developing an online tool that local staff will be able to use to submit all the documentation and verification needed to demonstrate compliance. And so part of what we're trying to do here is acknowledge the fact that this regional policy requires local work. And so what can we do at the regional level to try to reduce the administrative burden on all of your staff to just demonstrate that you're complying with the policy. So one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time at the regional level to do is to actually build out our land use database. So accurately understand the zoning codes in all of the cities and the county, put that into our own regional database, and then automatically calculate the average densities. And then the local staff will have the opportunity to review all of that data. But if the data comes out and says, hey, our data shows that you're in compliance, the staff can rely upon that and they don't have to go and do all the calculations by hand themselves. We're trying to automate that at the regional level. In these 117 individual meetings that we've been having across the region, a lot of questions have come up, many of which are very fair. I put 3 of them on the slide here in front of you just to highlight. So we're getting a lot of questions. What is the deadline for compliance? I'm saying 2026. That January 2026, December 2026, those are very different. That's a question we're getting. How exactly will the TOC policy impact the OBAG 4 funding? Is it an eligibility threshold? Is it going to be a points-based system, et cetera? And then finally, what does it mean to have flexibility and implementation? We've had that direction from our commission, but how exactly is that going to be applied in each individual circumstance? The quick spoiler alert here is I don't have the answer to all of those questions for you today. I'm just acknowledging that those are unanswered questions that your very smart staff are asking us. Those decisions, these questions are subject to further discussion and ultimate decision by the commission, ultimately. And so your representatives on the commission will be a part of thinking that through with us, So Commissioner Rabbit, looking forward to more conversation with you as well as others there. Okay, so in terms of next steps, we're planning to finalize the administrative guidance as well as launch the online submission portal with all that data. We actually have an alpha version of that portal out that some of your staff are already doing some data testing on, which we greatly appreciate. And they're pointing out some things that we know we need to make better. So we're working on that diligently. We're also continuing these meetings with local staff. And so the kind of one-on-one meetings as needed, we view this as a partnership. We're not expecting this to be like, there's a deadline, and on that deadline, everyone's going to submit everything. We would prefer to have this be a much more collaborative, ongoing process where local governments can submit the information they have. When they have it, we can provide feedback and work with each other towards achieving compliance so that it's not like a gotcha at the end. You submitted your paperwork, we reviewed it, we think it's not good enough, and now it's too late. We would much prefer to front load this as much as possible. And then finally, what I'm going to transition to in the next part of the presentation is that we are looking at regional funding and technical assistance that we can make available to all of the local governments in order to support their work to get into compliance. So I'm going to cruise forward into this part of the presentation. So as you see here, there's a variety of different ways that we're offering support. That includes grants, technical assistance, a number of other structures that we've set up with the support of wonderful partners like Four Leaf to actually work very directly with your staff and try to make it as easy as possible for them to move this stuff forward. Acknowledging that it still worked for them. You know, I keep touching on that theme and I'll end with that. And some potential ways that you can support your staff to move this stuff forward. So I'm going to highlight several programs that we have at the regional level and the ways that they can help in this effort. So one is the Regional Housing Technical Assistance Program. This was launched by ABAG as opposed to MTC. The Regional Housing Technical Assistance Program was initially developed to support local governments with their housing element update process. We received one-time state funds. MTC has now received a second iteration of these, and we're expecting to continue the program with this new round of state funding. As a part of this, ABAG granted dollars to every single local government in the Bay Area to support housing element adoption and implementation. So each one of your local governments actually received a check from ABAG to support that work. Additionally, I've got here over 230 pieces of technical assistance covering every topic you could possibly imagine. And some of that's because of the way housing elements are. All of you have been, I'm sure, working very hard on your housing elements. Actually, Sonoma's a great success story in the housing element arena in the Bay Area. Y'all were the first county to be fully certified in the 9-county Bay Area. And so, yeah, excellent work here, really great staff. And as you all know from your work there, it covers all kinds of topics. Everything touching land use, housing, affirmatively furthering fair housing, you name it. So we've got technical assistance to cover a lot of that. And then there's also been funding and administrative support for a new county-based planning collaborative with paid consultants who are supporting local staff and convening them regularly. And so this is going to pivot a little bit and give credit where credit is due. The team at Four Leaf helped pull together these next couple of slides just to highlight a little bit of the work that they have led through their contract with the County of Sonoma. In partnership with Napa, the collaborative up here, because of the size and the number of jurisdictions, there's a combination of the Napa cities and county as well as Sonoma. And so they have provided on-call technical assistance, hand-holding, products, webinars, you name it, to all of the local governments here in Sonoma County. Staffed by Four Leaf, led by Jane Riley, who many of you know from her extensive work in the county, as well as Luke Lindenbush, who is joining us here on Zoom. The focus initially was on housing elements. They were very successful in actually getting all of that to the finish line, along with all of you. And so that has enabled the collaborative to begin to focus on new topics moving forward. So you see here AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing, infill development, as well as vehicle miles traveled reduction, so VMT reduction. And those three pillars are driven by the latest fund source that we have available to support this program. And so that's a state funding source moving it forward. And the collaborative also helps to collect the voices of all of the local governments and the staff and be a conduit between the local governments and the regional government. So we have been working very closely with Four Leaf, but through them also all of the planning directors, as well as planning staff and housing staff in the various jurisdictions. So a couple of key highlights of what the collaborative has accomplished. As I already mentioned, it was the first county to be fully certified in terms of housing elements in the Bay Area. There's also a really fantastic mapping tool that some of you may be familiar with called Housing Connect that has a lot of this local land use data that I was talking about has already now been collected for Sonoma that we're then able to feed into our TOC policy tool. So we're seeing synergies between the work that the collaborative has been leading with the local governments and the work that we're doing at the regional level. There's also been a lot of webinars and updates about new laws. This is one of the most popular products that has been put out. There are a lot of new housing laws every year coming out of Sacramento, and it's like drinking from the fire hose. And so just digesting the new legal requirements, prioritizing them, identifying where local governments must take action versus where they don't have to take action so that staff can prioritize their work plan with your direction. That's been a major function of the collaborative. And then additionally, there's been a lot of work done through the collaborative to help local governments that want a pro-housing designation, that's a state designation, actually achieve that designation. And at last count, Sonoma had the most pro-housing jurisdictions of any county in the state. So hats off to the team at Four Leaf, hats off really to the planning staff in all of your cities and at the county. There has been a lot of excellent work there, and we're very proud to continue to support that financially. Okay, another program. This is one that's an older program, the Priority Development Area Program. These are locally nominated, regionally adopted areas where planning is anticipated to accommodate new growth. This is very connected to the Plan Bay Area process. And for over 10 years, MTC and ABAG have administered grants to local governments that are in the process of adopting specific plans around typically station areas. And so there have been a number of grants that have gone out to Sonoma over the last decade. Actually, currently, right now, we're administering 5 grants within Sonoma, totaling nearly $4 million, including the county, Cotati, Petaluma, Santa Rosa, and Sebastopol. So these are existing programs where there's already support being offered to all of your jurisdictions from the region. And we're very excited to continue these programs into the future. So in terms of what's coming up next, we are expecting another round of forthcoming grants as well as technical assistance. That will include ongoing financial support for the Napa Sonoma Collaborative, as I mentioned. And we're also expecting to provide grants to jurisdictions to help them with TOC policy compliance specifically. And so we're going to be experimenting with a more streamlined approach. There's actually several different regional funding programs. We're going to try to combine them all into one call for projects, make this as easy as possible for all of you and your staff to apply for multiple pots of funding in one go, all of which will help support local policy adoption that will lead to TOC compliance. So we are expecting to release that call for projects later this summer or early in the fall, with project selection happening in late fall or early winter. And then in addition to those grants, we're expecting to continue to provide tailored technical assistance through the collaborative as well as through our regional staff, building on the Housing Technical Assistance Program that we've been operating the last couple of years. So that was my last substantive slide. And I guess what I would just leave you with is, again, just further reflecting on the fact that this is work for your staff. And I don't want to sweep that under the rug. It's work for all of you. It's work for your communities. I acknowledge that many of you have now, or all of you, have just gone through a arduous housing element process. I know this cycle has been much more difficult than all the prior cycles. Some of you have probably already had a lot of housing policy conversations, land use conversations about density, zoning, et cetera. It is possible that those conversations that you've had, the housing element that you've already adopted, may not yet get you all the way to where you need to be for the TOC policy. There may yet still be additional changes. And so something that we've heard from local staff is, hey, we just went through our community to talk about rezoning, and now we're looking at this and we see that the standards that we're aiming for are different than what the TOC policy sets up. We may need to go back to our policymakers and have a conversation around whether and how we're going to make adjustments, or are we going to reopen some of these conversations. So I just want to acknowledge that there's been a lot of excellent work that's happened. This policy is asking everyone to continue to put their nose to the grindstones and keep working and keep trying to get closer to that goalpost again, the commission has also directed us that the goalpost, the end zone itself is not the goal very likely in 2026. We would like jurisdictions to get as close as possible, but we're going to have some flexibility. Is it sorry, I'm a college football fan, so like, is it, the 20-yard line? Is it the 10-yard line? Like, how far down the field exactly do you need to get? Again, we're waiting to get further direction from the commission. But there's going to be a need to do more work, knowing that not all jurisdictions are going to get all the way to the goal line this time around. So I do think as you're hearing from your planning directors, from your city managers, they may be talking to you about the need for updating work plans. They may be talking to you about the need to apply for some of this funding that we have coming down the pike. It's very likely that that funding would require a resolution from the city council or the board of supervisors as a part of the application process. So they're going to be coming back and talking to you about this. And so to the extent that you're feeling motivated to try to work closer towards the goal line, knowing that potential regional funding may be on the line down the road, there may be a need to balance with your staff their workload and how they're going to prioritize this body of work alongside what else they can do. And I think that's an area where certainly we're open to discussion, conversation. How can we collaborate? How can we be supportive as best we can, knowing that ultimately it's all of you and your staff that actually need to move the ball down the field. And that's the end of my extended metaphor and my presentation. Thank you for humoring me.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Bringing it back to my colleagues for questions. Director Kelly.
On your fifth slide, where you talk about the policy requirements, there's kind of 4 areas. The 4th area is transit station access and circulation. There was one bullet point that I felt like the lingo was a little over my head, which was complete an access gap analysis and identify opportunities for mobility hubs.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I appreciate that. It's a little jargony. So for example, you have a station area and the way that the current roads are aligned and the bike paths are like a little off. So like, let's say you have a regional bike path, somebody wants to take their bike to the train and then take the train to their destination, come back. Is there an opportunity for them to easily and safely get their bike from that path to the actual station area? At the station area, is there a place for them to put their bike and lock it up and have it be safe so that they can come back knowing that they're able to get from the station back to their house? So a station access gap analysis would evaluate kind of the existing area around those stations, identify where there may be problems. Maybe we don't have good enough bikes access to the station. And so we're going to come up with a project to try to enhance the bikeability of the station and connect it to nearby bike trails, for example. Or maybe the issue is we really want there to be, based on the local circumstances we have here, we actually think it would be really important to have different car shares parked here, because biking isn't going to be available for everyone, but we don't want people to have to drive to the station. But when they're at the station, they may need to grab a car to drive, a little bit farther than they would want to go on a bike. But we need a place to put, those 4 car shares. And so how are we going to plan for that? And then after planning for it, actually have capital dollars that can make those improvements in the station area. So the mobility hub is the idea of trying to weave together all of these different modes of transportation so that it's easy for people to hop from a bike to a train, to a bus, to whatever it is, and connect all of those at the station. So the way I would try to think of it is like, imagine you're just getting around and you're trying to not use a car. Like, what is the medley of options that you need available to you to make that workable and attractive? And that's the idea, the spirit, if you will, behind a mobility hub.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah. I'll admit, I'm a housing and a land use guy, so I've been learning a lot about the mobility hubs and access gap analysis myself.
What you said that made sense is like the station becomes the mobility hub, but in my mind, the way that was written, it's like the mobility hub is a satellite that's ancillary to the station location, but when you explain it like that, that makes sense.
Great question. Other questions from my colleagues? Commissioner Director Rabbit?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for all the work, Daniel. And I think for me, Daniel read it, but I just want to make sure that everyone really hones in on it, because I think the number one issue that we had in discussing policies on the regional level is that old phrase of one size does not fit all, especially when it comes to housing. And I think that if you read through the policies, it really talks about the pushing densities, but pushing densities relative to the location that you're in. So it is, and you mentioned San Francisco as compared to even Oakland or San Jose, but certainly as compared to Healdsburg or Cotati or anywhere else. But we should be pushing a little bit to the uncomfortable level, but not to the level that they're obviously going to be the same from major metropolitan urbanized areas and whatnot. And I do think that that was embedded in much of what you see here, and I do appreciate all the work that's been done going forward and the assistance that's put out there and answering those questions. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from my colleagues? I had a couple quick questions. One was, what is the Napa Sonoma Collaborative? Because I've never heard of that before, and it's great that you're funding it, but what does it do?
Yeah, so it's so the this is built off of a model that we've seen in several other counties where it's worked really well in counties, and this is most of the Bay Area, where there's a lot of different smaller cities that don't have a ton of staff, but that are facing really similar, typically state mandates. So the best model for this is called 21 Elements in San Mateo County. So there's 20 cities in the county, and they started this over 10 years ago when they had to update their housing elements. And there's a lot of work in the housing element process, again, as many of you know, where it's pretty standard state requirements that are needed. And instead of having every single city go in and have a staff person pulling the data from the same source, running the same calculations on those numbers, we're able to achieve economies of scale and efficiencies by collaborating together. And so San Mateo County did this very successfully. When ABAG received this one-time state funding, we took a bit of a bet to try to expand that model across the entire region. So the Napa Sonoma Collaborative was started just several years ago. So it's not surprising that you haven't heard about it, that it's still kind of gaining traction and building its brand. It only began in 2020 or really 2021. And so it's essentially just a way to hold space for all of the cities and counties between those two counties to collaborate on issues related to housing and land use. So they offer, so we pay, ABAG has paid for the consultants that staff that group, and then all the local planning staff are able to work with those consultants essentially as like a in-kind support, if you will, to receive specific support on some of their housing elements as well as other housing policies. But also a thing we've heard feedback from is it's also just really useful to get the local staff together. So the planning directors meet on a monthly basis, but the line staff, who are the ones like grinding it out on the housing elements, they don't always talk to each other across jurisdictions, but they're facing many common problems. And so this is a space for all of them to actually get together, talk, share notes with each other. And then when questions come up, the consultants can complete a report or do the research, answer those questions for everyone. And I guess if there's more specific questions, I'm also happy to pass it to Luke, who I think is on the line and can probably speak more specifically at the chair's discretion.
Sure. I mean, I feel like it would be great, maybe if at some point they could provide a presentation, maybe to mayors and council members, the board of supervisors, some kind of bodies, because it would be great to know what's going on. It sounds like a great initiative. Did you want to add anything? Scott, or is Scott? Is that what? Luke, sorry. I don't know where I got Scott from. Luke, I apologize.
No worries. Good afternoon, Supervisor Hopkins and board. My name is Luke Lindenbush. I'm the project manager for the Napa Sonoma Collaborative. And we have provided some, kickoff meetings for the housing element process and other meetings on state legislation to local jurisdictions upon request. But really, as Daniel mentioned, it's mostly been us liaising with the staff as they went through the housing element process, making sure that we could maximize efficiencies wherever possible, identify where there were sticking points in the certification process with HCD. So that's really been our focus for the last couple of years, but really moving into this REAP 2.0 phase, where we have to be focused on affirmatively furthering fair housing, infill development, and VMT reduction. There's a lot of opportunity to work on housing element implementation across jurisdictions and also help our jurisdictions implement the TOC policies. So definitely would be happy to keep the conversation going with any of you to how we can best support jurisdictions both individually and across the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke. I appreciate it. Does anyone else have any questions for Luke on the Sonoma NAPA collaborative? Not seeing any. I have one last question, which is some of our communities aren't on the 20-yard line or even in the red zone. We're up in the nosebleeds. We don't even barely can see the Jumbotron if we're going with your, sports metaphor. So I guess my question is, while I fully support the idea of transit-oriented communities, what about communities that are not transit-oriented but are trying desperately to become more transit-oriented? Are we going to have sort of a side effect of essentially starving already transit deprived communities who are then sort of less eligible for funding and become essentially more car dependent, even as there are growth pressures and tourism pressures and other things. So just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that, especially as it pertains to specific area plans, which could potentially pave the path for, transit implementation so that it become, a transit oriented community. So, that's something I've been trying to get some funding from MTC ABAG for the Lower Russian River specific area plan for 8 years. And the rules changed right before apparently I got on the board of supervisors. We're no longer eligible. And I'm just wondering, how do we get to that space where we can, quite frankly, absorb the RENA numbers that we've been allocated, and where we can actually provide reasonable transit access to get to things like SMART, and Golden Gate Bridge transit opportunities as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I think that, I'll be honest, that's kind of a tricky part of regional decision making when it comes to funding is how do we try to incentivize and encourage, what we want to see without creating these unintended consequences where we may be directing not enough resources to places that actually want them to build up. So one way in which the TOC policy addresses that is that it allows an opt-in for jurisdictions that don't currently meet the definition of having a fixed guideway transit station area. So for jurisdictions that would like to compete for kind of funding that's relative to the TOC policy, there is a possibility to essentially opt in. And so that would enable the jurisdictions to and again, what does it mean to compete in the TOC pot of funding? We don't know yet. The commission still needs to figure that out exactly, but that's the kind of direction generally that we're moving in, and there's a way for jurisdictions to access that. So that's kind of the most straightforward answer. Within this policy framework, there's a way to try to still yet be inclusive of those jurisdictions that don't meet the fixed guideway definition.
Great. And just to clarify, bus rapid transit is considered to be sort of fixed. Okay,
That is
great. And that's something that could be stood up with sort of, I guess, less official infrastructure potentially than one sometimes sees with respect to bus rapid transit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a definition of bus rapid transit within state law that we're currently looking to as the definition. So it would kind of need to meet that definition, but it is true that it is typically less capital intensive than, heavy rail.
Okay, thank you very much. Vice Chair Bagby.
Yeah, maybe you could clarify that last statement. I mean, I think you're referring to the minimum headways that would meet the state definition, and the Lower Russian River would not meet that. To the best of my knowledge, is that correct?
I don't know the headways there, and I will also be honest, I need to go back and look at the definition to know exactly what those are, but it is true, there are headways. There's also a requirement related to a dedicated lane. So there is still roadway infrastructure requirements as a part of BRT under that state's definition.
Yeah, I'm pretty.
So essentially 2-lane roads are impossible. And
yeah, correct. There are redwood trees.
I cannot think of an instance where that would work.
So again, I mean, that's where it's could there be flexibility? I would like to create sort of a bus rapid transit that just does not have its own. I mean, we don't have extra lanes, right? We have redwood trees and people get pretty upset if you cut them down, and we don't really actually want to create a new, just saying, maybe there might be some flexibility because I think that bus rapid transit can at least be more rapid than what we have without having, for instance, a dedicated lane.
Yeah, and that's one where the opt-in is the option. So, in order to opt in, you don't need to meet the definition of bus rapid transit. So if you have a service that meets the definition of bus rapid transit, you're in the TOC policy, kind of whether you want to be or not. Some of this is, it's, depending on your perspective, you could view this as a double-edged sword, right? Okay, if you have a existing transit station, then that may make you more, and you do all the policy work. then you're going to be more competitive for certain pots of funding. But if you have that transit station, you have to do all the policy work to be more eligible. And so again, depending on your perspective, we've heard kind of different opinions about whether folks want to be in the TOC policy or whether they would rather not be in the TOC policy. I think what I'm hearing from you, Supervisor, is a desire to see more of that, but it's part of a growth trajectory, if you will, of kind of how do we build up the service that would then sustain that kind of transit-oriented community, and how do we not use our regional funding to unwittingly discourage that from happening. That point is very well taken.
Appreciate it. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Vice Chair
no, on
Bagby?
that point, Daniel, thank you for the great presentation. And I think that we're talking about the lack of transit in our rural areas, and it's we get caught in a catch-22 in our rural areas, because MTC and ABAG, that you reward affordable housing development based on the number of potential units, when in our case we would benefit from it being more proportional to the size of the existing community. And I think that that's where we don't always qualify for some of the funding. And I think you're right. I think that I hear this at, I'm on the Transportation Policy Committee at Cal Cities, and cities in the Bay Area who are have that rapid transit area, and they don't necessarily want to be subject to these rules. Whereas we kind of have the reverse. We have areas where we want to have better concentration, lower headways, better service to our rural areas. But because of our existing population, we don't necessarily, qualify for the housing fund. So we get caught in a catch-22. So if there were a way and that MTC ABAG could also have a consideration for the proportional number of units in relation to the existing size of the community, that would be, something that I think that we would definitely benefit from. But as far as, I'm kind of, I don't know if I'm the only person on the board right now who's a little concerned about the transportation hub title. That is, we're in a position in Sonoma County, particularly, where we're trying to improve density in our downtowns, and the idea of having additional parking for shared vehicles, that might be something that might not be as attractive. I think that with autonomous vehicles, that might be one way to kind of, thread that needle, but just, considering where we are right now in 2024, I would be surprised if representatives from Windsor and representative from Healdsburg really be excited about another parking lot in their downtown area adjacent to their train station. And the fact is, I know that you mentioned that, you probably don't want to talk about, smart north of Healdsburg, but I'm going to talk about smart north of Healdsburg. And the reason I'm going to is that both Geyserville and Cloverdale, those currently those depots are existing rideshare facilities, and they are perfectly, they're perfectly situated to provide that rideshare facility for access to our rural areas, our wine country, tourism, to folks who are, who flew in from SFO and have to get to their house, out in Geyserville or Dry Creek or someplace like that, where it absolutely enables them to not have to drive their car into the southern part of the Bay Area. So I think that is something that is being overlooked as a planning strategy, because rural areas have something to offer. In addition to that, our areas that are in the lower river or in the eastern part of Sonoma County, in the town of Sonoma, those folks have a need to access access work, education facilities, and we need help being able to provide them access to the best north-south arterial that is not a car. So I appreciate that with this plan, there is a better synergy between housing planning and transportation, but there's still a chicken and egg problem that we have because, our best north-south service is smart, but our rural areas need access to it. And if we don't have the ability to do the infill housing projects that we need, we don't have the numbers that we need to then fund transportation. So and so what I'm afraid of is that Sonoma County will kind of continue to get stuck in that gray area. And so my feedback would be, we need to continue to work on that, listen to our staffs, listen to our elected officials. And, we definitely need to meet the needs of our urban transportation users, but we need to meet the needs of our rural transportation users as well.
I appreciate that. I would, point very well taken. And just that one clarification is that the TOC policy is not going to require anyone to build a parking structure in their downtown. So generally speaking, the TOC policy is orienting around having less parking. So I would, when I mentioned kind of like, maybe you need 4 shared parking cars, that's not at all a requirement of the policy. And it's more that generally the trend actually in the TOC policy is to significantly cut back parking in these station areas. And some of the challenges that we've heard and the way that gets implemented is, well, if you're going to have a lot less parking spaces, and currently a lot of people are driving and are accustomed to driving, how do you manage that transition? And what's the infrastructure that's needed to enable there to be way less parking spaces in those new apartments going up right next to that train station, while still letting those people kind of get around where they need to go? So yeah, definitely not the direction of the commission to try to make anybody build a giant parking structure next to the train station, acknowledging that in some instances, maybe that does make sense. If you had like a big new development that was residential and had a commercial component, and they actually had shared parking based on the different demand levels at the different times of day. That's a model that we're seeing in some places. Maybe then it would make sense. The TOC policy doesn't prohibit that. This is an area where I think there's some flexibility to try to accommodate different approaches that get at the nuances that you're discussing.
I appreciate that. And that's what I'm looking for, is a nuanced approach between some of those denser, more urban downtowns, and then the facilities that you have more room for in the more rural areas. And, you're serving both urban and rural. So both of those need to be taken into consideration. And again, you're right. You're absolutely right. That has to be a nuanced approach. And so that's what I'm looking for in the policy going forward.
Understood. Thank you.
Any other comments? With that, I would ask if there are any members of the public who wish to speak on this item.
Yes.
Great. And thank you for sharing the podium. Appreciate it. An excellent presentation.
Hello, my name is Dwayne DeWitt. I'm in the Sonoma County Housing Advocacy Group. That was a nice presentation. For many decades, I've been supporting transit-oriented communities, and before the turn of the century, started going to MTC meetings in Oakland, pointing out that there would be some ways to make some positive things happen up here in the north. The thing I started to really work on over 10 years ago was the idea of these priority development areas. And I pointed out that we needed that up here in Santa Rosa for Roseland, where we had a 264-acre Roseland redevelopment project area that wasn't being done, even though it was formed in 1984. So I kept advocating for that. And then when PDAs were adopted, I was like, all right, here we go. We're going to get something up there in Sonoma County. Well, I had not realized how city politics works, and they utilized that definition and that effort to make a really big PDA, to make it 1,000 acres, called the Roseland and Sebastopol Road Specific Plan. That was in 2016. I was on that team effort. And what we saw was that basically it was about developing the greenfields rather than helping up along Sebastopol Road, the commercial corridor, which basically is a 1.2 mile stretch that ran from Olive Street westward to Sebastopol Road and Stony Point Road to a giant major intersection where they had also widened Stony Point Road. So they put in a bus line along that Sebastopol Road, and it's dedicated in a way, but it's not rapid transit. There's not a special lane, and it takes a long time between headways. But the idea was, okay, they're moving forward on that. Unfortunately, the idea for this whole plan is that you get more housing if you can say there's a bus stop nearby. So you get those incentives, even if nobody uses the bus. And so we've been getting thousands of housing units planned for Southwest Santa Rosa area, nobody using the bus. So the transit hub for Santa Rosa is the transit mall. All right. The transit mall doesn't let the Amtrak train bus stop in there. So people, travelers from all over the world, anybody that's using our train system, they can't get into Santa Rosa at that transit mall. They're out by Coddingtown, and they got to find their own way in. So the reason I bring this up to you is because essentially you can support all these good things, but if you don't implement them, if these guys at MTC don't make compliance mandatory, things won't get done, and they take a really long time to get going, okay? So I'll leave you with this. The most important part of all of this for you is the housing, of course, but put it to where the transit really will be used by the new residents of the new housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. Steve? Good to see you in person today.
Thank you, Steve Bertelbaugh with the Transportation Land Use Coalition. Fundamentally, transit-oriented development depends on good transit. And we've been working with the transit operators for years to make transit more frequent and better. They'll need more parking lots for more buses. The Air Resources Board has told us that we need to double the amount of transit by 2030. We need to cut the amount of driving 25% by that time. That's not very long. We're coming on less than 5 years. Let's get focused on getting the transit there so that the builders will realize that there's money to be made by putting things around the transit. When you look at Santa Rosa and see the buildings that are going up now that we have a smart station, you can see what's possible. Now, that may not be popular for people who want to live in Sonoma County because they like the rural area and they like to be on a 2-acre lot. But I think we need to come up with the fact that we do need to cut down our driving and we need a lot more good transit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Anyone online?
There are no members of the board online wishing to speak on this item.
Wonderful. So I'll bring it back to my colleagues for any final remarks or questions. Director Kelly.
Just about how the OBAG funding will work for OBAG 4, and this is kind of a both of you question. So as we enter into the next funding cycle for transportation projects, like I don't know if you're specifically just talking about funding for planning efforts or land use as it relates to housing, or if this also relates to the OBAG funding. When I think of OBAG funding, I think of transportation and street projects, you know, like the projects that we all apply for our different jurisdictions, and then how SCTA allocates the funding based on different sources and formulas, similarly to how we did in this last cycle that included some OBAG funding. I'm curious how this will play into. So will you all be able to look at which of our jurisdictions and which of these projects kind of fits that TOC criteria so that we know if it's OBAG 4 eligible? And then if not, we will look for other potential sources of funding for some of those projects.
So let me start and then I'll pass it back. So the MTC will approve OBAG in they're targeting January of 26, right? And that's when we'll know the framework of the actual program. SCTA's plan is to do what we did with our last funding plan, where we called it, so SCTA funding plan cycle 1 will become SCTA funding plan cycle 2. We plan to do a call for projects in the summer of 25, so about a year from now, where we will ask for detailed information on all of the jurisdictions' priority projects for what they want to deliver for funding. That list will then give SCTA staff the ability to make recommendation to this board on multiple discretionary fund sources that are at the discretion of this board, including OBAG 4. The specific application that we will have them do will be developed by staff. There will be a follow-up application that we don't know all of the details yet. It'll be determined by MTC. And specifically to your question, it's typically a box that would be checked. Are you compliant with the policy or not compliant with the policy? And that is that compliance framework. Those are those salient questions that are still to be determined as with regard to eligibility. But I can tell you that for our process, we always want all of our jurisdictions to be compliant with all the policies, including the TOC, to keep us in good standing with MTC. And as a worst case scenario backup plan, we have multiple fund sources to pull from if we do have a jurisdiction that falls out of compliance.
So like similarly in the last cycle, when it was like, are you an equity priority community? Is this project fall within a priority development area? Like same type of criteria checkbox.
Exactly. And like for this one, it's straight up checkbooks. For equity priority community, it may be a point system where if you're serving an equity priority community, you get a single point. Whereas if you're within an equity priority community, you could get 2 points. Things like that to be able to prioritize those investments. You want to add some of the technical?
Yeah, I guess, as staff mentioned, I think from our side, the details are still to be determined. So, is it exactly checkbox? Is it some kind of points? How much discretion do the CTAs have? Would you all have in that regard? Those are all decisions that the commission will be debating and coming to, currently anticipated for January of 2026. We're expecting a pretty significant amount of conversation about this at the commission level within 2025. It's not going to be kind of like come out with the fully baked idea in 2026 and call it a day. There will be a lot of debate about the details. The piece that I would emphasize, though, is what you said is true. This policy is meant to affect the decisions for transportation projects, not just housing projects. So it is linking our housing and land use policy framework to the funding policy framework for transportation. So it, one example, just kind of trying to put this into less jargony words. So like, let's say that there is a station and there's already been an access gap analysis that's identified a need to connect a bike path, going back to my prior example. So maybe the jurisdiction that has that station area wants to put that project forward for funding. That project is in a station area, so it is in a TOC applicable area. So we may evaluate, okay, well, that areas, are they in compliance or not? And so whether or not you're able to get or compete for this funding for a kind of core transportation investment, if you will, may be somewhat contingent upon all of these other policy decisions that are related when we think about how do you make this a nice multimodal station that people can bike to, walk to, bus from, et cetera. So it is a kind of, again, drilling the point home. It's not just that housing money follows the housing policy making decisions at the local level. We're talking about transportation dollars following the land use pattern, the housing policy, the parking policies, kind of combined into this attempt at a cohesive approach to thinking about our station areas.
Vice Chair, or sorry, done, Director
Yeah,
Kelly?
take it.
Vice Chair Bagby.
Well, and actually, Director Kelly's question kind of spurred a question in my mind too, and that is, around the changing technology in transportation. What considerations are you giving to the fact that, Moore's Law is really going into effect where technology is changing transportation? I think I've said to James before that, I think transportation is where Luddites used to go to live out their natural lives, and now it's with due to technology. It's one of the most rapidly changing policy areas that we're dealing with. And so, and we've recently received a presentation on this from one of your colleagues at MTC about the standardization of the signage around the Bay Area. And my question was, how are these standards going to work with the transit app that we're using and with the rapid changes in technology? And his answer was, I don't know. And we're trying to figure that out. And so I'm wondering what component in this planning and I think rightfully so, you can't talk about housing without talking about transportation and vice versa. So I think that we're definitely headed in the right direction, but there are so many changes as far as e-bikes are concerned, the transit app that we're using, autonomous vehicles, electric buses, and on and on and on. So what consideration is MTC giving to these rapidly the rapidly changing market in transportation of all of the things that you're talking about in your, like whether you have a multimodal hub, how do you connect people from housing to transportation? What part of your plan is taking into consideration the rapidity with which adoption is taking place in all of our cities?
I'll do my best to answer that. I mean, I would say my answer is going to be something like my colleagues, which is I don't know exactly yet. We're trying to figure that out. A couple just quick thoughts. So one is that there's a lot of the TOC policy standards that are set by the resolution of the commission don't get into this level of detail. And so that provides a certain amount of flexibility in implementation, as we've heard from the commission, to kind of be nimble as needed as things change and evolve. So that's one area where I see some opportunity to get at your point. The second is that the commission can always revisit this. Like if we did something and it turns out that 5 years from now, that standard is wrong and there's kind of wide recognition that from a policy perspective, it's not achieving the goals of the TOC policy, the commission can always revise the policy itself, or the commission could provide direction to staff to make adjustments in the way that we're implementing it. Like I said, I think kind of from a staff perspective, at least, we're really viewing this as the beginning part of a long game process. These standards are, they're very ambitious. They're rooted in Plan Bay Area, which is a 30-year long range plan. So we know that these are the targets that we need to achieve if we really want to reduce emissions, if we really want to improve affordability, if we really want to achieve all of these interconnected goals, we've got to aim for these targets. But it will take a little while, and we're going to have to learn and adjust as we go along the way. Already just in the 117 meetings that we've had with local staff, we've been revised, like this administrative guidance we've been working on. We thought we were going to finish it like 6 months ago. And we keep having to revisit it because every time we talk to local staff and we get our hands dirty in the way that this actually is implemented, we got to go back and make adjustments. And so I think that we're trying to live that nimble and adaptive approach that I think your question calls for as best we can.
Yeah, that's what I'd be interested in seeing that. And I think it's evidenced in one of your earlier comments when you referred to SMART as a commuter train. I think we still do. But it's really a Luddite reference because the fact is that some of the biggest users of SMART are kids going to school, are seniors going out to lunch, going to museums, going to services. And it's really, it's not evolving. It has evolved into a rapid transit system, not a traditional commuter train, because people are using it. I mean, one of the things that I think I'm most proud of and staff is most proud of is how many people with disabilities are using it on a regular basis to get out to access work and to get out into the community and be active participants. And so, what I'm afraid of is that we say we're going to be innovative and adopt new technology, but we're still using those terms like SMART as a commuter train. It's not really a commuter train by the kind of the traditional standards. It's really community transportation. So I would be interested in making sure that our staff and give that kind of feedback. Is that transportation patterns? I think that's actually probably are leading into our next presentation. transportation patterns are changing and how people are using public transportation is changing, and we need to respond to it, not react. So, but thank you for the presentation, and that answer is I don't think I don't know the answer to how technology is going to change how we travel and commute within the next 5 years, but we need to figure it out together.
Thank you very much. Any other final comments? Thank you so much for an excellent, informative, and thought-provoking presentation. Really, really appreciate you coming up here and taking the time. And also thanks to our members of the public. Couldn't agree more, Steve, with the need for increased transit. And so thank you for all of your decades of work. And I think Dwayne might have left, but appreciated his comments as well. So with that, I want to recognize that we do have council members who need to get to city meetings, and we really definitely need to get to the next 2 items, which are action items. The other ones are reports. And I believe that Shauna has our next one with GoSonoma.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, directors. Lost a minute to get that up. Oh, thank you so much. All righty. So again, good afternoon. This presentation is for the final GoSonoma Strategic Implementation Plan. The Board Technical Advisory Committee and the Citizens Advisory Committee received presentations on the draft document in the fall of 2023. The document that is linked in your program has been updated fairly recently to correct some typos, particularly Director Reynosa's spelling of her name, as well as Director Kater Thompson's name, and some other minor typos, but it is the most recent and best version that is linked in your agenda packet today. Now I'll move on to the next one. To remind you all of the background, GoSonoma Act was passed by the voters as Measure DD in November of 2020. It was an extension of the existing quarter-cent sales tax known as Measure M. GoSonoma was approved by 71% of the voters, well above the 2/3 threshold needed to pass. And GoSonoma will pick up just as Measure M sunsets, so in the March-April 2025 time. So what's different about GoSonoma from Measure M? The apportionment programs where Measure M had 20% for road maintenance and rehabilitation, GoSonoma has 38%, with no increase in the existing maintenance of effort requirements. Measure M had 10% for transit operations, GoSonoma has 23%. The competitive programs make up the remainder of GoSonoma with 27% for moving traffic and improving safety, and 12% for building bikeways and pathways. In Measure M, only 4% of the measure was singled out for bike ped improvements. In Measure M, local street projects required a 1-to-1 match, and bicycle and pedestrian projects didn't require a match at all. In GoSonoma, all the competitive projects require a minimum of 15% local funding to bring as a match. So as we summarized last fall, GoSonoma has a couple of programs that are new and or different from Measure M. The first is a capacity building program that will use 5% of the combined move traffic and improve safety and build better bikeways and pathways to provide support to project sponsors to aid in things like preparing grant applications, technical studies, and public engagement. The program is meant to evolve to fit needs of the funding program as the grants become available, so it's adaptable. In addition, in the Build Bikeways and Pathways program, there is funding set aside for Vision Zero, Safe Routes to School, and other efforts totaling 1% of the total. In addition to the apportionment program for transit, there are also new programs meant to enhance transit operators assistance programs, such as First and Last Mile, and commuter and transportation demand management programs, and that's 3% of the measure. And the measure also identifies 2% of the GoSonoma transit funds that may be used to supplement or instigate free fare programs. Those funds will be available to the operators on a reimbursement basis and distributed based on the apportionment formula. So the layout of the plan generally follows the layout of the previous Measure M strategic plan. So Chapter 1 is the executive summary. Chapter 2 is the background. Chapter 3 is policies and procedures. Chapter 4 is the oh, I'm sorry, chapter 3 is the strategic approach and programming, and chapter 4 is policies and procedures. Chapter 5 is the financial plan and the cash flow model, and chapter 6 contains the information sheets for all of the projects that had been selected for the first round of funding. And the appendices contain the resources for and references for users. The only substantial difference from the draft strategic implementation plan that this body reviewed late last year is that the SCTA board approved loans between Measure M and GoSonoma to allow GoSonoma projects and programs to begin prior to the start of revenue collection in 2025. This policy was approved by the board in April in order to be included in the preliminary SCTA budget in May. The loans allowed for a well-capitalized Measure M fund, namely local street projects, to be used for loaning to GoSonoma. Those funds would normally be invested in short-term rate as part of the authority's pooled investment program in the county treasury pool. The board is able to set forth the terms of the loan, which include the estimated interest rate and the terms under which the loan will be repaid. The loan includes two principal amounts, 2.68 million in the first fiscal year, 24-25, and 3.22 million in fiscal year 25-26. The funds will be used for sub-programs in GoSonoma and its, in GoSonoma, which are move traffic and improve safety, and its corresponding capacity building, build bikeways and pathways and its corresponding capacity building, and build bikeways and pathways, safety and education, and commuter program, first and last mile. The interest rate will vary based on the actual rate of the county treasury pool, but the current average for the last 6 quarters was almost 2.1%. All repayments will be completed by fiscal year 26-27, and none of the loans will impact any of the Measure M projects. So that completes my overview. SCTA staff gave this presentation to the technical and citizens advisory committees late last month, and both of those committees recommended approval. So staff is seeking your approval today. Staff will incorporate minor changes into the document prior to printing the final electronic and hard copy versions, inserting photos where there are placeholder pages currently, and bringing the document into ADA compliance before posting to the web. And with that, turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments from my colleagues? Seeing none, or Director Hinton, is that it? No, just, okay, just stretching. All right. Quick question, in terms of sort of looking at the transit funding and, that sort of final mile, how should we go about kind of engaging on systems improvements? Would that be sort of reaching out directly to the operators, or is sort of SCTA going to play some kind of a role in here are the sorts of things that we'd like to see?
A little both. So SCTA will be working with the transit operators to develop programs. So we will be taking input from them and then developing them so that they will be able to access that funding.
So we should sort of talk to both of you then, if we have ideas. Okay, great, wonderful. Because one thing, I had a meeting recently with SMART leadership, and they were really sort of, I was saying, we really need to be able to actually access SMART in West County, for instance. And then they just sort of said, well, you should talk to Brian Albee. And I was like, well, this is really a holistic conversation. And so we kind of often, I think, get punted between different agencies and aren't quite sure, where to turn. So it seems like maybe reaching out to Brian, but then also like having a joint meeting potentially with, your team and SMART staff, maybe potentially as well.
Let me just also add that, so we did bring forward funding to this current fiscal year to develop a travel demand management plan. Right. So that plan is going to give an opportunity for this board to give input on how to roll out that 3% commuter program and the different programs within it. So that's going to be the key place to engage. Staff is currently working on an RFP that has not been released yet that will come to this board for contract award. And that is, I think, going to be the best place to engage at a holistic scale, as well as, staff's desire to be able to leverage those funds and not just parse them out. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Any other questions or comments from my colleagues? Seeing none, are there any members of the public who wish to comment on this item? Seeing none, would anyone like to make a motion on this item?
So moved.
All right, all in favor? Aye. Any abstentions or oppose? No, thank you so much for the
you.
excellent work and look forward to the next steps on this one. All right, and with that, I believe that BC is going to give us an update on our greenhouse gas inventory.
Good afternoon, board. I'll wait for just a minute while we get the presentation up and ready. No problem.
Yeah, it has it listed for some reason, doesn't actually. Yeah, action centers, receive and file a report.
Very good. We'll display down here as well. So. Well, here, as long as we've got it up there, I can get started. So, good afternoon, Chair Hopkins and members of the board. My name is BC Capps, Climate Programs Manager here at RCPA. Wanted to present you today with an update on or release the results of our latest greenhouse gas inventory report. And here, before I go any further, I want to make sure we get this straightened out. Very good, thank you. And let's see if they work. Okay, perfect. So I'm here today to talk about our latest update from our greenhouse gas inventory report, talk a little bit about our emission sectors that we analyze, and talk a little bit about our work with the local jurisdictions and the results at the local jurisdictional level. In the interest of time, there's a fair amount of details that are in these slides, and I think I may skip or move quickly through some of them. All the details that are in the slides are in our full report. So if there's anything that I move over too quickly, I'm hoping that that'll come back up as part of questions afterwards. But let's see. First, a little bit of an overview here of the work we have done in the past, our inventory efforts. Have been going on since 2016, and we have RCPA conducts a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. There is a distinction between a community-wide inventory that looks at all emission sources throughout the community versus an organizational level or municipal inventory that a lot of the local government agencies perform to look at their specific emissions. This is intended to kind of look at the big picture goal or the big picture. And so we have an effort of data collection and analysis. These preliminary results that I've assembled were presented to our members and partners and to our Climate Action Advisory Committee for some feedback there. And the results have been recently added to our greenhouse gas inventory dashboard. So as you can see here, this is the fifth inventory that's been completed via RCPA, and we are working towards these goals that are at the bottom center of the slide, really trying to zero in on carbon neutrality by 2030. And so these numbers will kind of show us where we're at. So in general, you can see here, this is our emission trends over the course of from 1990 to our current analysis that I've just completed for 2022. And as you can see, Sonoma County is on a downward trend, which is the direction we would like to be heading. Our total emissions for 2022 were 3.1 million metric tons. This is a 21%, just over 21% reduction from our 1990 greenhouse gas baseline. But the one thing I wanted to point out is that these numbers are actually slightly higher, unfortunately, than the numbers we reported in 2020. And the kind of, I believe the kind of short-term answer for that, or the short answer for that, is we really believe that 2020, that was highly impacted by COVID-19 pandemic, the economic slowdown, the stay-in-place orders. And so we actually think some of those 2020 numbers were artificially low. And what we're seeing is actually a little bit of a return to kind of the standard, the more standard trend that we were expecting to see. So the other key thing to take away from this slide here is that the majority of our emissions are 57.7% are in the transportation sector, 23.5 are in the building energy sector. Those two together combined to make up over 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions countywide. Those two areas and have been and continue to be the main focus of a lot of the work here at RCPA. Not our exclusive focus, but really the main focus. Here, these are the exact same numbers shown over a course of years, but broken out by greenhouse gas sector. So you can see there's kind of the sharp decline in buildings. That's downward stair step that we would really like to see. You can see transportation has been up and down for the last couple of years. And then in general, you can see the relative scale of emissions from water, solid waste, and agriculture as still being important and a focus of our work, but at a much smaller scale than the other than the larger sectors of buildings and transportation. This slide here, really the key take home on this slide, looking at the bottom, this shows emissions share per sector over the years. And the bottom shows percent change from 1990. Those two numbers that I have highlighted there in the lower right-hand corner show that in 2020, we were down 21.5% below 1990 numbers, and our 2022 numbers we're reporting are up just slightly from that, which is aiming at a 21% reduction from the 1990 baseline. This slide here has basically takes each of the emissions. This is looking at per capita emissions across each jurisdiction. And this is a handy way that we've developed to really kind of be able to compare because of the different population levels, the different density in each of the communities. If we look at it at a per capita level, it allows us to kind of start to compare a little bit about where each community is at. And again, my intent here is not necessarily to rank one community next to each other, but to kind of show that, you know, throughout the county, we do have a range of greenhouse kind of gas emissions levels, depending upon different aspects in the community, in the local community. But all of these numbers I wanted to point out are substantially below or appreciably below the statewide average, which is 9.7 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per person. And that is, and approximately half of the statewide or the national average of 14.4 metric tons per person. And the table on the side is kind of showing the total for kind of the population levels that this is based around. I wanted to then step briefly through each of the sectors that we analyze and dig a little bit more into the specific greenhouse gas emission sectors that we analyze. There are 5 different sectors that we look at. The first is building energy. Let me run them through really quick. We have building energy, we have transportation, we have solid waste, we have agriculture, and we have water. And each of those then is made up of kind of subparts. Within the building energy sector, we really look at electricity, we look at natural gas, and we use a category that is titled stationary sources in an area that had more industry or factories. That's where our factory emissions, some of the factory emissions would come in. For Sonoma County, that's the bucket, the subsector we use to basically try to count propane, kerosene, and wood use that is burned for heat or for cooking. So this graph here, kind of, again, I won't necessarily go into the hard numbers, dig too deeply into the numbers, but you can see the steep downward trend in building energy emissions from 1990 to 2022. And certainly in the report, one of the things that we do is we call out kind of some success stories and some reasons, some key drivers that have brought these numbers down or impacted these numbers over the years. This here in building emissions, I think, is one of our key success stories. As everyone here is well aware, is the incorporation of Sonoma Clean Power and the overall greening of our electricity supply throughout Sonoma County. What we're also seeing, and so you can see there that blue wedge that is the emissions from electricity. Electricity, you can see, are dramatically reducing over the years. The large orange block there, which is emissions from natural gas, that has been and continues to be one of our largest hurdles to overcome and to think about how to rectify. And so you can see those emissions as being, they have reduced over the years, but not at an appreciable level. So that's where a lot of our kind of using this data to focus in on kind of the work that we have for ourselves in the future. So that's building energy. Moving on to transportation. We have transportation emissions, kind of, we look at 3 sectors or subsectors. One is looking at on-road emissions. Those are all of the vehicles that we drive on a regular basis. We then look at off-road emissions. That's really a lot of the agricultural tractors, things like ground support equipment at the airports are included in the off-road subsector. There's a number of other kind of specific kind of agriculture, technical or got mechanical equipment and tractors and things like that. And then we also, starting 3 inventories ago, we started to also calculate emissions that come from the passenger rail service that are used by the diesel locomotives via the Smart Line, and trying to track those. One thing I certainly wanted to call out about the emissions that are associated with the passenger rail is those do show up as a emission source in our analysis. That is dramatically overcompensated, or over the flip side of it is the emissions reductions that come from everybody that rides the SMART system. And so even though it shows up as a positive, there are dramatic reductions that come from the use of SMART. So here you can see that big blue rectangle that's kind of constant throughout that is our on-road emissions. That's showing there are huge, kind of the huge challenge, yet opportunity that we have with looking at how to bring down those on-road vehicle emissions. Both through fuels, both through mode shift of getting people out of their cars and into other forms of transportation that are less carbon intensive, and then looking at the fuel shift of then, if people are going to use motor vehicles, trying to transition to zero emission vehicles over time. Next up, I wanted to talk about water emissions related to water. There are 2 key areas here. One of the first is water conveyance. That's all the electricity that's used for pumping water around the county. And the second is from the processing from wastewater, and basically the electricity that's used to process the wastewater, as well as the emissions that are produced as part of that decomposition process. So you can see here, in 1990, the vast majority of the emissions in the water sector were from water conveyance. Based upon the analysis that was done as the original Climate Action 2020 work, those emissions were really dropped quite significantly between 1990 and 2010, have continued to kind of stay level since then. One of the key success stories that we believe there is looking at the work of Sonoma Water and their carbon-free water program, and really all the work that Sonoma Water did countywide in looking to kind of reduce their carbon emissions associated with just the pumping of water. And that was both looking at major efficiencies in their operations, as well as incredible investments in renewable and clean energy to help power that. As well as their leading role at Sonoma Water in the helping with the creation of Sonoma Clean Power, and kind of to work together in synergy. Moving on to solid waste. We break out solid waste numbers by 4 different categories: single family, multifamily, commercial, and self-haul. These numbers come fairly closely. They come from Zero Waste Sonoma, and we use their waste characterization study to really do part of the analysis. Here you can see that emissions from solid waste have dropped dramatically over time. There's some extra color bars in those 2020 and 2022 graphs because the data has actually become a little bit more segregated or segmented, and we're able to pull out the numbers a little bit more with a little bit more nuance. The total, though, I think you can see slowly reducing, and the huge kind of opportunity that exists there has been and continues to look at reducing organic materials as part of the waste stream, because those produce methane once they are if they are left in the landfills. And so that has been a major push at both the state level with several sets of state legislation and at the local level to really reduce organics in the waste stream and to reduce those emissions. Our last major sector that we analyze is looking at agricultural emissions. The data for this really comes directly from the Sonoma County Crop Report, both looking at number of acres and livestock counts throughout the county. And here you can see that the majority of emissions we believe are really kind of coming from manure management and livestock, as opposed to kind of fertilizer applications. And you can see in this graph here, those numbers look rather large, but again, compared to the much larger buckets of buildings and building energy and transportation, this is still an area of opportunity for us, but is kind of a much smaller percentage of the overall pie of the overall greenhouse gas emissions kind of portfolio. One section I wanted to highlight that is actually new for the report this year. It is a fairly qualitative analysis at this point. We expect it to be more quantitative in the future, is looking at forest, land, and trees. And this is looking at opportunities for carbon sequestration, and especially in a lot of our natural lands and forest lands around Sonoma County. This section in this year's report really highlights two reports that were recently done by the County of Sonoma, and that was the Climate Resilient Land Strategy and the Carbon Inventory and Sequestration Potential Study. Both of those reports, I believe, were commissioned by the county's Climate Action Resiliency Division. And so those are both provided, and I believe a lot of work was also done with the Ag and Open Space District on those reports. And so those are really those are at this point is kind of our guidebook for how to move forward. And our hope is for future reports is it will be providing some more quantitative information that really is looking at projects such as the compost application project, or the work that we're doing with the Sonoma Marin Ag and County Climate Coalition. That's really looking at, that's working with the agricultural community and looking, it's a 5-year USDA grant that is looking at increasing or efficiencies in reducing carbon emissions from ag production here in the county. One of the last things I wanted to highlight then, all this data that we have been putting that is available as part of this report from both this year's report and from past years. I've been working very closely with our data analyst, Adam Garcia, who has constructed an online dashboard that is available online. I believe we brought an earlier draft of this dashboard to this board for some review. So I do believe that you've seen this before. We updated the dashboard last week with all of the current data. So everything that's in the report is now available online. This is linked directly from our RCPA website, as well as on the direct link that's there. This dashboard is what we're kind of considering, what we're calling the first generation dashboard. There are pages for each of the building sectors and a lot of access to the data. Adam and myself and a consultant we're also working with are working on an expanded and updated dashboard that we hope that we will unveil sometime towards the end of the year, which will be the same data, but in a refreshed look and with some additional features built in. Specifically, one key one is really going to be really trying to dial in on kind of a jurisdictional specific kind of profile pages and views, so that really each of the cities in the county can really zoom in and get a page and analysis that's very specific to them. So let's see, two slides here to wrap up with. First, kind of the take-home message from this analysis. We've decreased our greenhouse gas emissions 21% from 1990, but those have risen slightly from 2020. As I mentioned, we think that that's really an artifact of the low impacts from into the 2020 values due to COVID-19. Transportation continues to be our largest source of emissions. Building energy emissions, as I mentioned, are still large, but have decreased appreciably since 1990, as have solid waste emissions. Even though these numbers are going in the right direction, there is still a huge lift, a huge decreases that need to happen, and large-scale increases in carbon sequestration if we're going to meet our carbon neutrality goals for 2030. And the last slide I wanted to leave you with then was to talk very briefly. I didn't want to focus much effort on or focus much time on this, but to talk really briefly about some of our upcoming projects that are kind of on the docket that we are working on currently that have helped to kind of bring down these emissions further. First off, I will be working on the countywide equitable building electrification action plan. This will be an attempt to basically pull together all of the information that's available around building electrification, working with a number of resources from the Bay Area Regional Energy Network and from the county's Climate Action and Resiliency Division, and pulling those together and also working with Sonoma Clean Power and pulling this together into a kind of a single document that we can use as our building electrification kind of guidebook. There are also a number of programs through BayREN that are going to be incredibly influential and important over the upcoming years. They're retooling a couple of those programs, and we'll be able to provide some more information on that, but we continue to work very closely with BayREN on that work. And then in transportation, there's two projects I wanted to highlight. One is the current work that's being done on the countywide active transportation plan, and that's to provide support for walking, biking, and the increased use of mobility devices. This effort is including updates. It'll include updates to local plans for Cloverdale, Cotati, Healdsburg, Roanoke Park, Sebastopol, Sonoma, and the unincorporated county. So that will be a nice guide on a body of work that's being done right now on active transportation guidance. And then I believe later on in this meeting itself, you'll hear a quick update on the comprehensive transportation plan, which is going through some updates and is expected in late 2025 at the end of next year. We also believe that that will be one of the key guidance documents for kind of guiding our continued work to bring these emissions down. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for a very informative presentation. Questions from my colleagues or comments? Director Ford.
I got one quick one. As people shift to electric vehicles, do you have a method for capturing that electricity usage in the transportation, or does it just represent a movement over to the building sector?
Very good question. In our current inventory, the way it's been done in the past and the way it's currently done, those EV emissions or that electricity used for electric vehicles is still counted in the building's energy analysis. I believe that there is a method for us to extract those out and be able to report them separately and to be able to track that difference, that growth in electricity use over time. The current data still has that embedded. I came up with a very similar method to pull out the water conveyance numbers, basically using electricity to pump water around, but we wanted that to be reported in the water sector. So that's actually one of the top items that's on my to-do list now, is to dig back into that and look at some of the materials that comes from California Air Resources Board and some of the analysis tools we have to extract that piece out. So,
Thanks.
sure.
Great question. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, are there any members of the public who wish to speak in person on this one? Seeing none, any members of the public online?
Speak, we will start with Rick Lutman. Rick, I've permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you, BC, for your report. I wanted to comment on 4 of your graphs. The first one was that remarkable decline in the contribution from the building sector. It was quite amazing to see that, and it'd be nice to see more of the graphs going down, but unfortunately, many of them did not. The transportation level sector was pretty much level for many years. I think we know what has to be done to get those down. We have to drive less, and drive less with gas guzzling cars. But I have a question about how to make that happen, because it's got to be done by convincing people that they need to travel less or travel more effectively. And I wonder if you have any comments about how to proceed with public education on this. And then there was the agriculture sector, which is small, but it didn't seem like there was much change. And I was guessing that was because it plays such an important role in the county's economy. But then you showed a graph that showed most of it was coming from manure. So does that mean that we need fewer cows in the county? What could be done to reduce that small but significant contribution? And then finally, the matter of natural gas use. Electricity went down, but gas didn't. And so what can be done about that? I think there's a requirement now, or there will be soon, that new construction has to be all electric. You can't use gas. But there's an awful lot of buildings that already exist and aren't going away soon that are designed to rely on gas. So how might the county go about trying to reduce the gas consumption? These are a few of the issues I was thinking about during your report. I'd be happy to hear about any comments you can make. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Next we have is Tom Conlon. Tom, I have permitted you to speak. You may start when you unmute yourself.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment on this new iteration of the greenhouse gas inventory updates. At our BC was able to present these preliminary results to our Climate Action Advisory Committee, and there was concern expressed around the table that progress has been to date inadequate to our need for progress. So I think that it's important to recognize that many of the jurisdictions in the county made a commitment to reduce emissions by 25% by 1990, from 1990, by 2015 originally. And here we are in 2022 and still haven't met that initial goal. I'd also point out that in the court decision identified that this methodology that we continue to use leaves out the emissions associated with air travel, although it does show off-road transportation emissions. And I'm clicked through here on the dashboard and I see that they've actually increased substantially since 1990 in that category, which also includes agriculture, as BC explained. I too would like to reiterate Rick Lutman's concerns about how do we deal with our agricultural emissions? There doesn't seem to be any effort really focused on that right now in the county. It is roughly 12%. It's not insignificant. It's something we need to work on. And hopefully we can do it by other methods, simply by then reducing the number of animals here. But if that's what we have to do, perhaps that's what we have to do. So there's a lot of concern in the community about the slow progress. We know people here are more committed than other parts of the country, but we do need to continue to pay attention to what will make a difference. And in particular, it will be reducing vehicle miles traveled in transportation, improving the electrification of both buildings and transportation methods. So appreciate taking the time to listen to my comments about this, and let's hope we can work together to improve this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Chair Hopkins, I don't see any other members of the public who wish to speak on this item.
Thank you so much. And BC, I'm wondering if you wanted to respond to some of the comments and questions raised in public comment.
Yes, I do. I want to refrain from getting into too many details right now. Given that the focus of the report is really on the inventory and the numbers, kind of an existing conditions report. On all of the issues having to do with electricity and natural gas and the built environment. I think those are all key questions that are top of my mind with thinking about the building electrification action plan that I'll be working on next, and attempt to articulate those out and pull those kind of out so that we can have a more robust discussion around those. On the issues of agriculture and manure, that is not an area of my expertise at all, but that is something that we as staff are working very closely with all of the resource conservation districts throughout Sonoma County and Marin County as part of this Sonoma Marin Ag and County Climate Collaborative. And I think that those are issues that I really want to bring back to that group and try to get some more guidance on from kind of that perspective of what is the bigger picture there of efforts and other kind of things that are being used, techniques that can be used to bring down those emissions.
And I actually could jump in with a couple of things that I know that are currently working on. So number one, Northern Sonoma County Air Pollution Control District is actually really leading the way on trying to support electrification of on-farm vehicles and tractors. And so we've actually had sort of showcases out at, local farms of showcasing electric tractors and actually providing subsidies, right? So that folks can actually switch out, existing gas and diesel powered tractors for electrified versions. I've been trying to push the Bay Area Air Quality Management District to do the same thing, and they're sort of a little bit slower in their turning, but they're also open to that possibility in terms of grant funding. And then I do also want to mention that in terms of methane emissions, one thing that has proven to be effective is actually supplementing with kelp meal. The challenge is that kelp meal is very, very expensive. And right now, dairy farmers are just struggling to make ends meet. And so it's actually something that I give my goats free choice. They love it, but it's like $150 for not a very big bag. And I only have a couple goats. And so it's, so you scale that to, a dairy operation, and it's quite large. But I do know that those are a couple of things. I would also add that while there are emissions associated with animal agriculture, there are also actual carbon sequestration benefits of rotational grazing. And so that's also something that's, I think, important to kind of acknowledge on the balance sheet. So sorry, I just want to jump in because I know that those are a few things that have been worked on.
Very good. Thank you.
Back to you. I interrupted.
That's all
Broke
right.
the train of thought.
That's all right. And I think the last thing I wanted to mention is on the very complex topic of transportation. I think that's one where there's continued work that we can do between the two sides of our house here, between the Transportation Authority and RCPA, with kind of thinking about what's that overlap. And how do we work together with thinking about specifically around the active transportation plan and other efforts that are coming forward where we can really dig into what's the nut, how do we crack that nut of on-road transportation emissions And in this case, we are not alone in facing this challenge. There are not a lot of communities out there that I know that have a winning combination on this right now. And so I think that as much good work as we do here, we still have more to learn and more that we can do, but it's, I think we're learning, we're doing as other organizations, how do I phrase this? We are making progress in a difficult area that is also stymieing many other areas and organizations as well, so.
I agree. And I want to say that I really do think that we're taking this seriously in Sonoma County. And the challenge, I think, is that it is so multifaceted. And while there are public solutions available, there's also a lot that rests on private behavior, right? I mean, I don't think captured in this, right, is the Amazon effect and, you know, individual consumption patterns. I recognize that one of the public commenters addressed air travel. And, you know, we have not gone so far as some European countries have. I believe France has a ban on the books and Spain was considering it to ban short flights, essentially, where you would have an equivalent train alternative that's, you know, less than 2.5 hours. Challenge is we don't actually have a whole lot of train service on this coast. And definitely not a lot of reliable train service with the exception of SMART, but that's a, you know, much shorter scale than, you know, a 2.5 hour flight. So anyways, food for thought. It's very, very challenging and always open to constructive feedback. But I do want to say thank you so much for this phenomenal presentation and all of the work that went into it. It's really fascinating to see how things break down by jurisdiction, per capita. Not surprised, of course, that unincorporated, you know, has the largest transportation emissions because we, again, don't have great transit. And so how do we really look at trying to, you know, balance these numbers and make progress? So thank you very much. Director Rabbit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for bringing up the, on the agriculture side of things. I'm thinking, have we, maybe it goes to the methodology, because the truth of the matter is that we've lost thousands and thousands of animals in this county in the last so many years. And I'm not sure how that's reflected in the numbers that we have. Are you only looking at commercial establishments? Are you looking at the, you know, folks with a few animals around their own personal properties? We only have 54 dairies left in the county. We used to have triple digits not that long ago. So I'm kind of curious how those numbers haven't changed over the course of time and what's driving that, because I don't think it's certainly not the dairy side of the equation.
Very true.
On
PC?
that topic specifically, I can pull together some summary numbers rather quickly and we pull those numbers directly from the county crop reports that are produced annually. But what would be interesting to look at is the diversity, the change of that makeup of the livestock over the course of years. How has that changed between dairies and others and in relative numbers?
So essentially by sector as opposed to sort of agriculture lumped together is what you're, yeah.
In the deeper analysis, in the
Mhm.
Excel spreadsheets, it is pulled out by the livestock type. That's not something that I have a summary graph right here, but that'd be interesting to look at over time from 1990 to the future to the current, how each of those kind of subsectors of livestock animals has changed over the course of that time.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's important to note too is that, you know, if folks are sort of consuming local products, right, there's also a climate benefit to that as opposed to importing, say, beef from South America, right? And so when you look at, I mean, it gets very complicated very quickly on the agricultural balance sheet. Sorry, Director Rabbit, anything else?
No.
Vice Chair Bagby.
Yeah, thank you for the report and the level of detail. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense of, you know, just looking at the transportation numbers and as you said, it's like they're so much tied to our housing and development patterns. How much do you think, or where do you think this report can really inform our future planning? Because you know, actually, I was just looking at the letter that Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition sent in about the greenhouse gas inventory report. And I pulled out the quote, I believe the strategy is too heavy on fuel shift and too light on mode shift. And I don't think that we can have a mode shift until we address our built-in environment. We're gonna hit a plateau. You can tell people, you know, you really need to get an electric bike, or you really need to walk, or you really need to bike. But, you know, at the same time, I think it was over the weekend that there's a, you know, a call for CHP and the sheriff to address the problems of aggressive drivers harassing cyclists. So I'm just looking at, you know, there are only going to be so many people who are, you know, brave enough or can have, you know, a number of bad experiences and still stay on their bikes and not. So I'm just wondering, like, when we're going to, you know, reach that peak of not being able to have the mode shift because our built environment really isn't, in so many places, isn't safe enough, or people aren't confident enough to do the mode shift. So, and what I'm concerned about, and I think, you know, probably know where I'm going with this. I think we've kind of like, we've hit all of our low hanging fruit. So where is the opportunity? And then where are the real changes in, you know, how each of our cities and each of our communities really address these barriers to getting these numbers to come down? And it probably is one of the big orange problem is transportation. So, but you can't talk about transportation without talking about housing, and you can't, you know, and jobs and where they're located, and where schools and where they're located. So, you know, what's it going to take? BC. What's it going to take?
I think
and we can schedule it. We can probably create a whole new board to address that, but yeah.
I wish I had a simple answer for that. In the very short term, as far as the mode shift, you know, fancy term for getting people out of their cars and using, you know, other forms of transportation. I think that there's a lot of opportunities right now for to use the information that's in this report in conjunction with our active transportation planning work that's being done, and to really look at how to ratchet that lever to kind of get people, what is the motivation? What is that special combination that makes it finally that somebody is willing to take that risk, take that chance, give it a try on one day and see, oh, that didn't work out, but maybe I could do it again and do it on a second day. You know, so I think that it's really, at least in my mind, it goes back to really working in the very short term with the active transportation plan and the impacts of that plan throughout the county.
Yeah, I think my real concern is that I think so often, you know, we kind of it's easy to point fingers that, you know, at either SMART or Sonoma County Transit or any of our transit agencies, say, well, that's the problem, when, you know, there isn't really a way that a transit agency working on its own can address the legacy impacts of sprawl development, which was developed for cars. So I'm going to ask the question again. I don't expect an answer, but I think that it's a big problem that we really just don't have our heads around. I think that, you know, in so many cases, so many of the challenges that we face of being able to get people either on a multimodal trail, or to a bus stop, or to a SMART station, it has everything to do with zoning and development patterns. And something that I've complained directly to the Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition about is that I think that the same guys who are, you know, saying, where's my bike lane, are the same ones who go to a planning commission meeting or a city council meeting and say, I don't want that apartment in my neighborhood, or I don't want that high density development in my neighborhood or my backyard. And I think that that's, from a policy perspective, I think that's the greatest challenge, is that we aren't making these connections as to the fact that, you know, SMART, which collects a 1/4-cent sales tax, and Sonoma County Transit and our bus agencies, which are grossly underfunded, the responsibility for retrofitting for sprawl development cannot sit solely on their shoulders. We have to have a conversation in this county about our development patterns and the legacy impacts of those, because we're not having those high level discussions, aren't happening where they need to happen. And we're just gonna, come to this meeting, complain that we're not, we're not meeting our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals if we don't have that conversation. So it's like, it's so important that we have this report, but I think that it points to the fact that we need to have a larger conversation about how we retrofit our infrastructure on multiple levels, and that it's a transit agency isn't going to solve it, SCTA isn't going to solve it, RCPA isn't going to solve it, but we're all going to have to work together to get where we want to go. And the irony is that I think we'll all be happier. I think that it will have a huge impact on our public health, our mental health, our job opportunities, our educational opportunities, but we have to get real about sprawling single family homes and sprawling commercial developments and the zoning that the legacy zoning that we have, and how we're going to be able to retrofit it and get to where we want to go in the future.
Thank you very much. I see that Steve Bertelbot is asking to speak, and we did already do public comment, but I think it's okay to reopen public comment since you are here in person.
Thank you. One issue that we need to pay attention to is that a very high percentage, more than 50%, close to 60% of our driving is for trips that are shorter than 2 miles. Those could be walking, those could be on bicycles, and it's going to take time because our habits take time to change. But safe streets are a big issue, and Petaluma is doing fine. Santa Rosa is doing quite a bit, but making it safe for people to ride their bicycle and then getting them to change their habits and use the bicycle, I think is a very, very big part of the solution. Thank you.
I knew there was a reason that I reopened public comment. That was a wonderful comment. Thank you so much. And could not agree more. I think that is absolutely critical. And I will say that, personally, my family and I walk every weekend to the downtown farmers market because we can do it on a class 1. There are other places that I would never, ever be able to walk or bike because I take my life in my hands in order to do it. And it's just not worth the risk. So we do need to do better, and we can't, it's a, sort of chicken and egg, cart and horse kind of a situation, right? The roads need to be safer. We need to create more class 1, trails in order for people to make that switch. But trying to force people to make that switch when the infrastructure is not ready, it just is not, it's not safe, sadly and unfortunately. Any other comments or questions from my colleagues? And I want to acknowledge that this is a report, but it is listed as an action item. So I think the action is really to receive the report, but we should take that action since it is listed as such. Would anyone like to make a motion?
So moved.
All right, Gerard's on it today. Who's at the second?
Second.
Tie goes to, I don't know, Director Lowe? Okay, we'll give it to Director Lowe. All in favor? Aye. Any abstain, any oppose? Seeing none, that carries unanimously. Thank you for all of the excellent work. Really appreciate it. And with that, we are going to be moving on to Adam, who is going to talk about our travel behavior study.
Right. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and directors. Adam Garcia, data analyst for transportation and climate. I'm here today to give you an update on our travel behavior study addendum. We'll go over the main findings and then jump into some of the travel zone profiles. So as an overview, this is actually a continuation from a travel behavior study that came out in 2017 and 2018. So this is expanding the timeline that we're looking at from 2017, 2019, and 2022. So it's looking at snapshots of a day in spring, looking at people's cell phone, tracking where they move, but also vehicles that have transponders such as delivery trucks. So in a way, this is mode agnostic. We don't know necessarily the difference between transit, bicyclists, walking, and drivers, but knowing what we know, most of the people are going to be driving this most likely. So the results are broken out by the 9 jurisdictions, and then the county is broken out into additionally 11 unincorporated travel behavior zones. We look at travel within the county, which is the intra-county trips, and then inter-county, which go between Sonoma County and then a select number of other counties. So the data is very simple in what we're getting back. It's the number of trips. So from one zone to another, the vehicle miles traveled, the average trip length, and then the morning evening commute. And just to step back real quickly, there have been some significant influences on Sonoma County's travel behavior during this study period. As many of you know, we are in a state of population stagnation or likely decline, where the domestic population is declining as well as foreign immigration rate. There have been a number of fires during this time, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the cost of living increase. Just to note real quick on the actual physical document of that's attached, the Sonoma of the actual report, there are a few corrections in progress. One is just a slight modification to Cotati's populations numbers, and then also is noted there is a duplicate map for Arnold Valley or Arnold Drive in the one of the zone profiles. So moving on, here we can see a map of the different travel behavior zones and then the specific traffic count locations. So we get the mobile device count data, but then we have to make sure that that's validated with these specific traffic locations, where we actually can say what's the count for the mobile devices going along the freeway, then what do we actually count? And so we make sure that those numbers match each other so that the data we have is reliable. So the high level findings are that 90% of the trips that Sonoma County generates stays within Sonoma County. Anecdotally, from what I understand, that's highly unique among counties in the Bay Area, being very self-contained. Most of the other counties have a high degree of trips going in between. So that makes us unique in particular. Other things to note is that there hasn't been that much difference in that distribution of 90% of intra-county trips for the 10% of inter-county. What's significant to note, though, is that of that 10% of the trips, which are inter-county, account for almost half of the VMT and then those associated emissions. So you have to drive far to get out of the county, which unless you're one of the edge cities. So that adds a lot. The overall average trip length is about 9.5 miles, but I think to underscore some of the discussion that's already been happening, so when you look within the incorporated jurisdictions, the average trip length is actually more about 2.6 miles. So thinking about how we can replace those trips with electric bikes, for instance, if we can build the safe facilities, that's a great way, an opportunity for us to reduce our emissions. So at a high level, looking at who are our biggest commute and visiting partners around the county, Marin is #1, Napa, San Francisco, Solano, and Mendocino are the top counties that Sonoma interacts with. Just wanted to note actually real quick, going on to this, getting back to this, there were some additions with changes, which you can see in the report over the course of that time from 2017 to 2022. Lake County added 3.6 thousand trips. Mendocino added 2.3 thousand trips. Solano added 2.9 thousand trips. On the other hand, San Francisco, we lost about 4.1 thousand trips. Napa lost 6.3 thousand trips, and Marin lost the most of 13.5 thousand trips. So the travel zone profiles show the following information. We'll be able to walk through an example here to save time. So this is Cloverdale, and I don't have a pointer, but on the left side, you can see kind of the total VMT population differences per capita how those change. We also see total trips and then average trip length. And then on the right side, the map shows our attempt at an infographic. So looking at where those trips are distributed, how much stay within the travel zone. So the thickness of the arrow denotes the number of trips. And then just down below that, you can see the difference of intra-county and inter-county trips, and likewise inter-county VMT and intra-county VMT, showing that higher difference of inter-county VMT being much higher. Sorry, and just to point out real quick, to highlight, Cloverdale has a significantly high number of intra-city trips, and also to note, the white arrows are showing where there's actually trips going outside of Sonoma County. So Mendocino County being its closest neighbor captures a few of those 1,000 trips there too. Let's see, Fort Cotati is unique among the jurisdictions as it has a higher trip count to Windsor and Santa Rosa than it has within its city limits. Healdsburg demonstrated the greatest decline in VMT per capita among jurisdictions, going from 64 to 55 VMT per capita. Petaluma has the second highest number of intra-city trips across jurisdictions, which, as I mentioned, underscores the point of how those trips could be more easily replaced by an e-bike or an e-tricycle. Let's see, Rohnert Park showed an increase in VMT over the study period, possibly due to new housing development. Santa Rosa has the highest number of intra-city trips, but also has the lowest VMT per capita among jurisdictions at 34 VMT. Sebastopol's trip distribution is shared between the city, North County, and the mid-county travel zones, so distributing around those three areas primarily. The city of Sonoma has the lowest average trip length of 1.9 miles per trip in 2022 across the different jurisdictions. Windsor also shows a very high proportion of trips staying within the town. And then we're just highlighting 2 unincorporated travel zones, but as I mentioned, there's 9 other ones. The unincorporated north has higher numbers of trips going into Santa Rosa than staying within the large travels unincorporated north zone. And Sonoma Valley shows a strong interaction with more trips going into the city of Sonoma than staying within the Sonoma Valley. So there's lots of data within there. Unfortunately, the data doesn't give us the answers. We have to kind of infer quite a bit from why are these numbers changing. So hopefully maybe some of you as the professionals might know why some of these might be impacted, but these are kind of our best guesses at these impacts. So we will be, as I mentioned, making a few more updates. So if you do catch any errors or anything that needs correcting, please reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from my colleagues or comments? Yeah, Director Lowe.
Just have a comment regarding Sonoma Valley, and it was interesting when you showed the adjacent area, especially on Arnold Drive, because really it's a highly populated area. It's not a typical county area would be like more like Shelville or something like that to the south. It really feels like most of the people there think they live in the city limits. So it doesn't, when I look at that, I'm thinking of what would this be like if this were all considered the city limits, and it really would be people traveling within the city limits, because that area does not really feel like it's outside the city limits for the people who live there.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Director Ford?
Just one quick one. I found it hard to navigate without page numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, definitely note that. Thank you.
I felt the same way. And actually, one question that I have, what is West County? Because there's unincorporated middle, unincorporated north, unincorporated south, and then it's kind of like we don't exist. So I'm just kind of curious, what is our designation? I was looking at the sort of travel behavior zones, like what would the lower Russian River and the coast be?
Yeah, so the coast would be broken out probably between mid-county and unincorporated north. But primarily West County would fall into that unincorporated north area. So the travel behavior zones, I believe, were in the 2018 report had much greater detail. A lot more broken out. We had limited funding for this one, so we had to limit the number of zones. But a lot of the feedback we've received after presenting to CAC, TAC, and PAC is great interest in trying to dig into greater geographic specificity, but also the modes, visitors, through trips. So this is helpful data, but it doesn't get necessarily to the detail that I think a lot of us were interested in, including being able to distinguish West County, the Russian River area. Those are big areas to highlight. So something that we definitely want to focus on in the next iteration.
Yeah, I just feel like, I would like to be able to use this kind of data to drive, for instance, transit provision decisions. But if the Lower Russian River is lumped in with all of everything in North County, that's really not helpful. And I would assume that maybe I don't know if it's also then lumped in with like Sonoma Valley, which is like roughly of the sort of same latitude. Like, I mean, I don't know. I feel like there needs to be a little bit more detail in order to actually use it to drive decision-making processes. So hopefully in the future we can get that. Maybe we can work. I saw there was the collaboration with Sonoma County Tourism. I wonder if kind of accessing the mobile data might be something that we could kind of get more specificity on. And then my sort of other comment was that I know that these are typically done on sort of quote unquote peak traffic, but not all areas have peak traffic on weekdays, sort of, that 9 to 5 window. I mean, I could not get to Guerneville pretty much, sort of last week during the holidays. And it's like, if you go at 7 in the morning, it'll take me 15 minutes. If I go, at 10 or 11, on a hot day, it can take me an hour. Right. And so just thinking about sort of traffic counts that pertain to visitors. And I wonder if there's some way that Sonoma County Tourism could be a partner in trying to get some of that traffic data so that we can develop cool things like enhancing the Russian River shuttle that has become very popular, trying to get transit there. And I'm guessing that areas like the Valley, up by Geyserville, Healdsburg also kind of experience a lot of that kind of weekender tourism. Because our sort of peak days, I would say, are like Friday night and Sunday, and you just see this sort of mass, kind of exodus and, migration in and out of the coast and the beaches. So it would be awesome to get more data that we could use to drive decisions if that's possible. And I wonder if Sonoma County Tourism would be open to, funding or looking at some of that, again, so that we can improve visitors' experiences by coming up with ways of alleviating traffic, like expanding mass transit and Class 1 bike trails. So just food for thought.
Yeah, we've had several discussions with Sonoma County Tourism. They're incredibly interested in this data. The one other variation we have that's in the actual written document is looking at the AM, PM distribution. So that's more focused on the commuter mode, not the tourism factor, but gives us one other little slice of the view to at least understand where people commuting to and where are people commuting from in Sonoma County. So.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I do see Sonoma Valley had its own section. Sonoma Sky Park had its own section. So I'm just sort of surprised again that like the coast, like 55 miles of coast couldn't be considered a zone, or the Lower Russian River, which has like, 12, 13,000 people living in it, would also be an awesome zone to look at. And one of the highlighted for sort of our Vision Zero, as well as sort of a high traffic fatality corridor. So hopefully in the future, we can get some information so that I'm not just living in a black box out there in West County. Director Kelly?
I just wanted to share, as I look at this VMT data, and then we look at some of the other information we're receiving about our workforce and how many folks live and work within our city's jurisdiction versus how many people commute in each day. So as we're seeing the number of retirees go up in the city of Healdsburg and the number of school-age children going down, we're also seeing the percentage of people who live and work in Healdsburg declining year after year, and then more people commuting into the city. So I think those might be some other data points to look at, which would be indicators of yay, we have less VMT, but unfortunately we also
have less workforce participation. And so what does that mean, you know, on a holistic basis?
Great point. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Vice Chair Bagby.
I just, yeah, and want to echo some of the comments. Folks in Cloverdale, and I appreciate that you have to make these breaks in, you know, North County versus unincorporated North County. We are so intertied with Alexander Valley Winery Zone. So I guess just going forward, I mean, just so similar to the Sonoma Valley area. We just need to be able to slice and dice this data so that we can look at it from a regional perspective, a city perspective, multiple perspectives going forward. I appreciate that you actually did pull out some of these destination areas like the Grayton, Rancheria Casino, because those are you know, focal points of activity, especially where traffic is concerned. But I think we're also kind of talking in legacy terms. We always have, you know, we have to consider commuter traffic. One of the worst traffic situations in my city, though, is school hours. You know, and some of the worst impacts on air quality is people lined up to drop their kids off to school in Cloverdale because we don't, which for some silly reason, we don't have school buses anymore. So those are the kinds of little pockets of concentration and challenges that we need to be aware of. But I do appreciate that you pulled out or teased out some of these, you know, destination areas like Alexander Valley, but we also need to be able to look at it from a larger regional perspective. I just want to make sure that we're also doing that moving forward.
Yeah, and I will just say, not to beat a dead horse, but if Arnold Drive gets its own freaking designation and the 13,000 people who live in the lower Russian River or like the entire coast don't, like there were 700 trips total Arnold Drive South. Like really, I mean, come on, like what are we thinking? I feel like it just does, I mean, it's like there was no one on the board from West County at the time fighting for this. And maybe there was someone who has a thing about Arnold Drive on the board. And maybe we could have a more equitable approach in the future would be appreciated instead of deleting my entire district. So with that, on that note, thank you for your work. I know it wasn't your decision to delete West County, but hopefully in the future, we can add that, and it will take time to get baseline data because we don't have it because we don't exist right now, but I'd love to exist in the future. So I don't think that we have any vote required for this item, so I think we can just move on. Thank you so much. And I think that we have the possibility, since the hour is growing late, of deferring 5.5. Would that be your recommendation, Executive Director Cameron?
Yes, please. Dana Trey was ready to substitute for Chris Barney, but given the late hour, Chris Barney will be here in September to give the presentation himself.
Great. So we will sort of defer that one to future meeting. And then maybe we can sort of breeze through our reports and announcements. So do you want to start, James, with the executive committee update? I don't think we need to take any, or wait, I don't think I took public comment on the travel behavior study.
There was something else.
We're on the same wavelength. Okay. Would any members of the public, anyone from West County who doesn't exist, like to come step up at the podium right now? Seeing none, and hey, Sebastopol has one.
That's
It's
right.
just everybody else doesn't exist. All right, anyone online?
No one online.
Okay, with that, we can officially move forward, and we won't be taking public comment on item 5.5 because we are postponing that to a future meeting. So we'll take public comment then and move on to our reports and announcements. So Executive Director Cameron with the Executive Committee report.
Thank you. At the executive committee today, we talked about Sonoma Clean Power Coordination. We also covered an update on the strategic vision and organizational alignment. Thank you all for the interviews that have been conducted. We have our final interviews scheduled for Wednesday, and we'll be wrapping up that portion of the strategic vision and organizational alignment. On the legislative update, there is an additional handout that went to the board in addition to what was in the packet under consent that covers the fact that there will be a climate bond going to the ballot this November, as well as an educational bond, and also to point out that the regional transportation measure that MTC is not moving forward within the legislature, but MTC is conducting a select committee to keep that work going to make sure that a future regional measure to address the transit fiscal cliff will come forward to the legislature in 2025 and will not be at the expense of any one county. So that work will continue over the next 6 months. Additionally, we talked about future meetings, including September, where we expect to be providing an update of the opening of bike share and the specific date that bike share will launch at the smart stations and jurisdictions up and down the smart corridor, as well as a confirmation that our August meeting is canceled. And that concludes my executive committee report out.
Thank you so much. Regional agency reports. Does anyone have anything they want to report on their regional agencies?
I can
Want to jump in?
Golden Gate Bridge if you'd like, Chair. So we approved the budget with $32 million of transfers in. Obviously, that's not sustainable in the long term. We have had discussions with MTC about 2026, so we'll see what happens when we get there. We're starting to do some efficiency cuts, in particular to the bus division, where we have had a shortage of bus drivers, some of them having to work 60, even 70 hours a week. So we developed an apprenticeship program through Santa Rosa Junior College and College of Marin. We've hired new bus drivers. And so there are more bus drivers to bid the routes that are available. And yeah, so now that the increase in fare or toll on the Golden Gate Bridge is going into effect, we're hoping that that combination will help to right the ship. But there are major difficulties in regional transportation agencies. So that's kind of my report. The bridge traffic is up slightly, only 2%. Ferries, however, up 22%, and buses are up about 13%. So incrementally, we're coming back and we're providing service as is warranted. That's it. I don't know, David, if you want to add anything else.
That was great.
Great. Anything else from anyone on trying to think? I don't think there's a bunch of news from the Air District to report out, either of them for that matter. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to, we've got the advisory committee agendas. Those are in the packet. SCTA, RCPA activity reports with Ross.
Good afternoon, directors. In the interest of time, I will be very brief. The things I'd like to highlight are a little more information in the report, but basically wanted to highlight the State Route 37 Policy Committee. Meeting was held at MTC on June 6th. In addition to helping to run the meeting, staff has been working to make SR 37 materials more accessible to stakeholders and the public, particularly in terms of coordinating the websites. That's a big part of it. There's a lot of moving parts. And there's going to be our staff will be attending a communications team charrette on July 12th to continue this coordination. Other things, just continuing to update on the Hearn Avenue work. Working with the Caltrans PIOs on that. We're getting it out in a number of ways, but SCTA staff does have a specific list if you would like to be added to that directly. I know City of Santa Rosa is in the midst of that and getting the word out really well, but we have an email that's going out every Friday. And those are the main highlights. Please let me know if you have any questions on any communications activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ross. Any questions? Seeing none. Tanya, I think, is coming up next with our climate change activities report.
All right, I'll keep this very brief. There are two items that I wanted to highlight or bring to your attention. First, we did submit an application to the Office of Planning and Research's Adaptation Planning Grant Program for funding to develop an energy resilience plan for Sonoma County. And we partnered with two community-based organizations on this application. And we're looking forward to hearing the results of our application in the September-October timeframe. So I will keep you posted on that. And then actually two other items related to funding. We've been working with our political consultants to make connections with some of the first focused on the federal agencies. So we've had meetings with staff from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy's Office of Community Engagement to build relationships with those agencies and learn more about federal funding opportunities. This is something that we'll continue to do going forward. And then lastly, wanted to let the board know that we are reviewing information on the next round of funding for EV charging through the Department of Transportation's Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program. We facilitated a meeting last week with members of a local government EV partnership, which is staff from the local jurisdictions, and the planning director from the San Joaquin Council of Governments to learn more about their successful application to this program in round one. It's a great example of a successful application. And I know that several of the jurisdictions that applied for this funding through round one are considering applying again in round two. And we are in conversations about doing a county-wide application. So combining our efforts to have a more compelling grant application. And so we'll continue working on that. And that's what I wanted to highlight for you here this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you. I'm super impressed by how much information you all managed to pack into these really short updates when we're running late at the end of the meeting. So thank you for that. And next up, I believe we have Steph with the planning activities.
Hello, I'll be very brief. For the VMT mitigation program, we had a kickoff meeting with Fehr and Pierce in June. We are now working on assembling the project technical advisory committee. For Plan Bay Area 2050 plus, the regional transportation plan, we are reviewing draft project performance and transit network results. The next phase of Plan Bay Area 2050 plus, public outreach is now underway, and MTC will be tabling at 2 locations in Sonoma County during August. For the county-wide active transportation plan or CAT plan, the phase 2 of public engagement wrapped up. We are now gathering feedback and integrating it into the plan, which is forthcoming. For transit integration, we have the integrated transit service plan that came to SCTA, RCPA board back in June and was presented to Petaluma Transit Advisory Committee in June as well. It is now in the Board of Supervisors agenda and will be presented to the Santa Rosa City Council in July 23rd. For the regional bike share pilot program with Drop Mobility, they hired a local operations manager recently, and they did site visits for the hub locations in Sonoma and Marin in June. So that's moving along. And finally, as James mentioned, the transportation demand management RFP is being drafted, and once it's ready, we'll present it to everyone.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we can move on to projects and programming activities with Margot Ocañas.
Good afternoon. If I'm last, I'm also going to be no notes, so I'll be short. So the update is there were several ATP Cycle 7 applications that were submitted, 2 for Santa Rosa and 2 for the county. I would anticipate that awards will be coming out towards the end of the calendar year or beginning of next year. On the grant side as well, you're looking at the project lead for the Safe Streets for All 2023, which was awarded. So, excuse me, we're in the process of finalizing our agreement with FHWA, and I would anticipate that we have our contractor on board during the fall. And as a reminder, that focus has a countywide and a City of Healdsburg Safe Routes to School plan, as well as some speed reductions specifically for Healdsburg, as well as countywide, and then a project specifically in Petaluma. So I'm actually personally very excited about this, having led and grown Safe Routes to School in Southern California. I'm excited to dig in on that particular project. And lastly, we are submitting a multi-jurisdictional Safe Streets for All application. Should have water before this. At the end of August, we're working with 5 cities, Cotati, Rohnert Park, Santa Rosa, Petaluma, and Windsor. So this is a quick build demonstration project, and have really taken to heart the conversation that I've heard today. As a female who rides primarily on bicycle, even though I've come from Southern California, I've recognized how difficult and odd I may be as someone who opts to travel that way. But I think these demonstration projects, we can both do community engagement activities where we're popping up some of these trial events and having those conversations with the constituents as to what is challenging their transition to the mode and better understanding that. So in part of this application for the Safe Streets for All, we're building in some really solid outreach so that we can have those dialogues, have people give us feedback on the treatments as we put them in as quick build, with the hope that we're setting ourselves up for better permanent treatments down the road. So I think that's it. Any questions?
Yeah, Vice Chair Bagby.
Sorry, I don't want to get between you and a glass of water, but
Sure.
just what I think I'm hearing too is maybe finally a focus on looking at kind of our old county roads that lead into our communities that have slowly been annexed by cities, and they're still kind of state highway-ish, like and specifically, you know, Old Railroad Highway, I think up and down the county, and other roads that go east-west. They are old state or, you know, county highways. And that's places where kids are walking to school either from a development that's either been annexed or it's just outside city limits in my case. And those are really the danger points. I mean, we have a perfect example in Cloverdale, and we're hoping to solve it with the First Street Bridge project and Asti Road, that comes over First Street and Asti Road, but it's the bridge that goes over the Russian River and onto Geysers Road in Cloverdale. We have kids who walk that bridge all the time. I've been walking it to school, and you know, fortunately now we're going to have a bike and pedestrian addition to that bridge. But it's you know, a dear friend of mine was hit on her bicycle. She was a competitive cyclist for much of her life. And the only time that she's ever been hit by a car was just outside of Cloverdale on a county road. Those are the real, at least in my area, those are the real problem points that need to be addressed. And it sounds like some of these pilots are going to kind of try to address this issue of this kind of big wide county road that has in reality become a main thoroughfare for folks who are trying to walk and bike into town.
No, it's a fair point, and I think we have turned to the cities to, again, the 5 jurisdictions, and ask them for their recommendations of the corridors that they would like to improve. And they are a combination of those types of streets as well, the neighborhood streets. What definitely is bubbled up, which I think will help make a strong narrative, that all the corridors they've suggested have a very strong bent towards the safe routes to school, towards park, and to transit. So everything that we've touched on today about trying to connect those areas that generally are the routes for the most vulnerable users are in fact elements that are being targeted for those improvements. So I'm excited to think about not only the safety as defined through road safety, but also trying to think out of the box about partnerships with greening activities and cooling and shading in this era of heat, et cetera. Safety can also be defined that you're actually making it as a physical body safely through some of these corridors under the heat. So how do we get creative with those partners on the greening side, potentially on the CBOs who may be able to help with some of the equipment and the libraries of e-bikes or some of those safety trainings. So really trying to think holistically for the purposes of making this grant as competitive as possible. So thank you. Thanks for your work on this.
Thank you. And any board member announcements? Director Kelly.
The city of Healdsburg has voted to place Measure O on the November ballot. It's a pro-housing ballot measure. The city council voted unanimously to place it on the ballot. And so you may be hearing more about it in the future, but we are the only city in Sonoma County that has a growth management ordinance that was adopted by our voters. We're one of few left in the state. And this initiative would allow a certain geographic portion of our city, all infill projects for multifamily projects to be allowed to be built just based on the zoning and not subject to the maximum of only 30 units are allowed to be built per year.
Awesome. Thank you for that update. Anybody else? Going once, going twice? All right. Do we have any public? Director Hinton, you're so close here.
No worries. Just City of Sebastopol tonight has a Zoom presentation, and then on Wednesday night, a live town hall regarding sales tax measures, talking to our public about possibility of putting a sales tax measure on for November, 1/4 cent or 1/2 cent. And we have been running surveys on the same issue.
I have seen those pop up in my Facebook newsfeed. All right, any other questions or comments? And then let's go to public comment. Are there any members of the public in person who wish to comment on this item? Any of the report outs? Anyone online? All right, seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. How do you feel like it's going with the sales tax measure? Do you feel like it's like,
I mean, we just got, report from, we got 30 something.